For those of you who are new to this, at 9:30 every Saturday night in Melbourne, I connect my transmitter, which is that device there, to the antenna up on the roof on ham radio, and we transmit a regular Saturday night series of spoken word recordings with the intention of making people think or giving them an excuse to process historical or literary information, so that after we play this, the people will be stimulated, hopefully, to make a response and we can get some conversation going. So from 9:30 to 11 p.m, 90 minutes, starting in a few moments, I'll be pushing this button on my transmitter and going to air, and I'll explain the rest then. I listen off air with these. And this is a kind of a tradition that's been going on for the last 40 years in Melbourne. Now, if there should be an interruption to this streaming, please don't be surprised. This has been a week of incredible wind damage in Melbourne, and a lot of the cables for internet came down on Thursday night. A lot of the power supplies for the relay amplifiers for internet are also being disabled, so this might be problematic. Anyway, it's 9:30. On the air we go. Hello, this is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test transmission of spoken word material. Hoping everybody is okay. I can't hear anything on the channel that we're on, 147.475 megahertz. So, hoping for the recording to work. Always a good sign when that works first up. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. And that's the NBC chimes, recorded in 1930. Probably the oldest recording you'll hear tonight. Except very late at night we might put some cylinder records on after midnight. It's been quite a week in Melbourne. As I mentioned, Thursday there were severe windstorms. And I'm mentioning this because I know that on the YouTube stream, I'm actually streaming on YouTube concurrent with operating on 147.475. Just checking that the transmitter's okay. Yeah, all the dials are reading the right numbers. And in the Dandenong Ranges and points east of me, there has been extensive flooding and lots of trees have come down. One unfortunate characteristic of Australian eucalypts is their propensity to crack, break and drop large limbs, or even the whole tree if there's sufficient wind. And people who live in the Dandenong Ranges out east of here are people who choose to live in the forest, and that is beautiful and a lovely way to live under most circumstances, particularly in the summer heat of Australia. But it comes at a price, and that price is a risk from falling limbs and indeed a risk from bushfires. If you're prepared to take that risk, well, I guess that's your choice. But a number of people have come to grief. I've seen on the news several houses completely smashed by mountain ash 100 feet or more in height, with many tons of wood in them, landing on houses up in the Dandenong Ranges particularly. So, to those who are listening on battery-powered receivers, my commiserations, and I'm sure I wouldn't like to be in that position. I'm fortunate in being on the west side of Dandenong Creek, which is the city side, which is less likely to experience that sort of problem. I see on the net we've got excellent connection there, so presumably we're doing well. And hello to John Young, I see on the text box. There is a text box where people can communicate back to me on the YouTube live stream, which you can find by dialing, or rather by searching for the phrase VK3AML 12 June 2021. That's search for, in Google search or whatever, VK3AML 12 June 2021. There'll be quite a few tracks to play of vintage audio as we go on tonight, including a couple of tracks which I was alerted to by old high school buddies, actually. Some hilarious stuff on the true meaning of electricity, and a new device which will revolutionise mankind called the Turbo Encabulator. The Turbo Encabulator. All that will be revealed soon. I'd also like to welcome to the stream Sue Fiskin, who's the daughter of a very old friend, a friend named Kevin Duff, who at the time I met him in 1972 was in charge of Telecine at the Australian Broadcasting Commission's Elstonwick studios. And Kevin, being a generous chap, knew that I was interested in electronics and particularly building a mechanical scanner for television, and the one thing we needed for that was a very high sensitivity photoelectric detector. And the most sensitive detector that was around in the early 70s was a thing called a photomultiplier. And Kevin would hover over the Telecine machine, which he had the responsibility for maintaining at Elstonwick, looking for the time when any of the photomultipliers would show the slightest sign of a problem, a fault, which he could use as an excuse to take it out of service so that he could hand the slightly below broadcast quality photomultiplier to us for our experiments. And here is that very tube, an EMI 6097 photomultiplier. The front of it, called the photocathode, where I'm pointing, is semi-transparent, most sensitive in this case to green and blue. And after the light hits this photocathode, it emits electrons. They're attracted by 1000 volts that you apply to this tube. Yes, I guess it was a little dangerous giving a tube requiring 1000 volt energising to a couple of teenagers as we were then, but we're still alive. Well, I am. Dan's passed on, but that was due to a brain tumour, sadly. But in there you can see a Venetian blind structure, multiple what they call dinodes. So the electrons emitted from this photocathode hit the first dynode. Twice the number of electrons that hit that dynode are emitted. They are attracted to the next dynode. That multiplies by 2 again. And so you get multiplication, 11 stages inside this tube. I'll see if I can hold it up and still get reasonable focus there. That is a photomultiplier, and that was a device that allowed Dan and I to get moving picture slow scan television, rarely achieved, onto 160 metres shortwave radio in 1972. Almost 50 years ago. I still have the tube. So thank you, Kevin. And in absentia, note Sue Fiskin, I still have it. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night missions, as they call them. And I'm looking very red in the monitor, and I don't know whether that's reflecting reality. Perhaps it's a reflection of my red jumper. Okay. Tonight there are quite a few recordings that I'll be playing relating to the latter days of the Second World War, specifically from the D-Day landing through to the Cold War of the late 1940s, and in connection with that, I'll be playing a program that I found this week on public access internet from the American Public Broadcast Service, the PBS. They put together a program on the last time an aeroplane flew into a building in New York before the 11th of September 2001. And that was on the 28th of July 1945. A B-25 bomber in heavy fog made a wrong turning at LaGuardia Airport. And would you believe, it sounds almost comical, but it was really tragic, flew up Park Avenue into the Empire State Building on its 80th floor, much to the consternation of people who were on the lookout on the 86th floor. A total of 14 people were killed, and the interesting part is that a researcher in USA has managed to find quite a few of the survivors of that Empire State Building disaster, interviewed them. Not only that, he's found that in one of the offices in Park Avenue, somebody was dictating a letter into a dictating machine as the plane was flying up Park Avenue. You can actually hear the plane buzzing past his window, at which point he falls silent, not surprisingly. And then there is an almighty thud. But first, let's have some comic material just to get people loosened up. This lecture was sent to me by a friend of mine from high school, Deb Johnson, who always had an excellent sense of humour. And she thought that I'd find this lecture on electricity highly illuminating, also highly amusing.
Today's scientific question is, what in the world is electricity? And where does it go after it leaves the toaster? Here is a simple experiment that will teach you an important electrical lesson. On a cool, dry day, scuff your feet along the carpet, then reach your hand into a friend's mouth and touch one of his dental fillings. Did you notice how your friend twitched violently and cried out in pain? This teaches us that electricity can be a very powerful force, but we must never use it to hurt others, unless we need to learn an important electrical lesson. It also teaches us how an electrical circuit works. When you scuff your feet, you picked up batches of electrons, which are very small objects that carpet manufacturers weave into the carpet so that they will attract dirt. The electrons travel through your bloodstream and collect in your finger, where they form a spark that leaps to your friend's filling and then travel down to his feet and back into the carpet, thus completing the circuit. Amazing electronic fact. If you scuff your feet long enough without touching anything, you would build up so many electrons that your finger would explode. But this is nothing to worry about unless you have carpeting. Although we modern persons tend to take our electric lights, radios, mixers, etc. for granted, hundreds of years ago, people did not have any of these things, which is just as well, because there was no place to plug them in. Then along came the first electrical pioneer, Benjamin Franklin, who flew a kite in a lightning storm and received a serious electrical shock. This proved that lightning was powered by the same force as carpets. But it also damaged Franklin's brain so severely that he started speaking only in incomprehensible maxims, such as, "A penny saved is a penny earned." Eventually, he had to be given a job running the post office. After Franklin came a herd of electrical pioneers whose names have become part of our electrical terminology. Myron Bolt, Mary Louise Amp, James Watt, Bob Transformer, etc. These pioneers conducted many important electrical experiments. Among them, Galvani discovered, this is the truth, that when he attached two different kinds of metal to the leg of a frog, an electrical current developed, and the frog's leg kicked, even though it was no longer attached to the frog, which was dead anyway. Galvani's discovery led to enormous advances in the field of amphibian medicine. Today, skilled veterinary surgeons can take a frog that has been seriously injured or killed, implant pieces of metal into its muscles, and watch it hop back into the pond, where it sinks like a stone. But the greatest electrical pioneer of them all was Thomas Edison, who was a brilliant inventor, despite the fact that he had little formal education and lived in New Jersey. Edison's first major invention in 1877 was the phonograph, which could soon be found in thousands of American homes, where it basically sat until 1923, when the record was invented. But Edison's greatest achievement came in 1879, when he invented the electric company. Edison's design was a brilliant adaptation of the simple electrical circuit. The electric company sends electricity through a wire to a customer, then immediately gets the electricity back through another wire. Then, this is the brilliant part, sends it right back to the customer again. This means that an electric company can sell a customer the same batch of electricity thousands of times a day and never get caught, since very few customers take the time to examine their electricity closely. In fact, the last year any new electricity was generated was 1937. Today, thanks to men like Edison and Franklin and frogs like Galvani's, we receive almost unlimited benefits from electricity. For example, in the past decade, scientists have developed the laser, an electronic appliance so powerful that it can vaporize a bulldozer 2,000 yards away, yet so precise that doctors can use it to perform delicate operations to the human eyeball, provided they remember to change the power setting from bulldozer to eyeball.
Oh, dear. Thank you, I think, Deb Johnson. That clip appeared on the internet some 20 years ago. And you'd be surprised at how many clips, unlike that one, are intended to be taken seriously and frequently refer to such interesting concepts as free energy and perpetual motion. So I need not tell you what they're trying to sell. Well, how much hope they have of remaining out of jail. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test, and streaming on the internet, look for VK3AML. 12 June 2021 you should find us. Now, moving on to the turbo encabulator. The boys at Chrysler have a surprise for everybody. An entirely new device whose sole purpose appears to be to increase the amount of service work done by Chrysler. Let me introduce the turbo encabulator.
Hi, I'm Bud. I'm Tony. Here at the Dodge Division, Viper Automotive Operations, research has been proceeding to develop a line of heavy-duty transmissions and differentials that establishes new standards for reliability, durability, and quality. Talented engineers like Tony have been striving to make automotive history. He's part of the same dedicated team that brought us the revolutionary automatic head scratcher, the gnarly wank shaft spudulator, and of course, the fruited Pop-Tart. Now they deliver to us what will be the next milestone in Chrysler's engineering history. With customer needs as our primary focus, work is proceeding on the crudely conceived idea of an instrument that would not only supply inverse reactive current for use in unilateral phase detractors, but would also be capable of automatically synchronizing cardinal gram meters, formerly referred to as gear rattle or clunk. Such an instrument is the turboencabulator. Now, basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of the power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it's produced by the modial interaction of magnetoreluctance and capacitive diractance. The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with the panametric fam. Now, the latter simply consisted of 6 hydrocoptic impeller vanes so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the Lotus O delta type placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator, every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible tremie pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the gram meters. The turboencabulator has now reached a high level of development and is being successfully used in the operation of Nofer trunnions. Moreover, whenever a fluorescent score motion is required, it may also be employed in conjunction with a drawn reciprocation dingle arm to reduce sinusoidal depleneration. In other words, all gear rattle and driveline clunk through the use of the turboencabulator has been fixed. Thank you.
Thanks, Bud. Now that we know how the turboencabulator works for the Viper GTS and RT10, let's take a closer look at its diagnosis and service. For the purposes of obscurity, we have removed the casing to expose the heart of the turboencabulator, the magnetoreluctance modial interactor. Since little or nothing is known about the principles involved in magnetoreluctance, diagnosing faults can be a problem. Connect the DRB3 to the aft end of the Moxie interrupter using special adapter WUPB2, also known as the WUPB2, making sure the osmolality of the phase detractors is not extrapolated. Begin the test by selecting model year, VIN number, paint color, location of battery, vehicle mileage, and model type, and the turboencabulator run test. If there are any system faults, they will be displayed in secret code on the DRB3 display. It's a simple head code, anyone can catch it. The most common fault is sigmoid rumbling below the belt line, which the customer will refer to as a burping or even a hiccuping noise. To service this fault, refer to the Turboencabulator Diagnostic Procedures Manual and Songbook. And perform test TE10. Using the Geiger scale on the DRB3, measure the Roentgen output of the capacitance reactance flux muster. If it's above 10 RGs, replace the unit. If it's below 10 RGs, you'll be directed to do a series of tests that will effectively raise the billable hours for the service department, but will perform no other useful function. All other faults should be treated as if they do not exist, and the customer should be told that the burping or hiccuping, or what has been referred to by some customers as gear rattle and driveline clunk, are normal and is caused by too much gas in the fuel system or improper driving habits. This, of course, can be remedied simply by turning up the volume on the radio or by inserting the optional earplugs.
Finish the script. Finish the script.
No, the grip isn't finished. He's Scottish. Oh, thanks. Back to you, Bud.
Well, that's about it for this month's installment of the Dodge Division's Viper Automotive Master Tech Tips. Be sure to watch next month when Tony and I cover headlight adjustment, diagnosis, and repair. From all of us at Dodge, see you then. Some fire, huh? I'll never forget, it was in the mid-'70s when a scenario much like this one took place at Ford Studios. You remember the Pinto, Tony? It's quite funny, actually. The technician had backed into a kitchen set, and of course the Pinto immediately burst into flames. Of course, that happened in a rehearsal, not unlike your televised faux pas. Oh, by the way, you better have those burns checked. I'm not sure this eyebrow is going to grow back in. Maybe you could wear a monocle or a patch. A patch. Yeah, you could be known as that swashbuckling engineer that single-handedly destroyed the turbo-encabulator. Well, enough of this. Feel like getting a drink, Smoky?
The Chrysler Turbo Encabulator. Perhaps we could stick it on the transmitter and find out whether our dingle plate works properly. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Well, so much for the levity. Let's now return to the usual run of historical audio, and I thought this week we'd concentrate on that interesting period towards the end of the Second World War where the Nazi regime crumbled to be replaced by the end of 1945 by a Cold War which lasted for the next 30 years or so. A lot of shifts, a lot of huge shifts in politics affected not only countries and national boundaries, but of course the broadcasting, the media, which in those days internationally didn't mean satellites or internet as it does today. It meant shortwave radio. So a lot of the recordings you're going to hear in the next half to 3/4 of an hour are going to be recordings made 75 years or more, in some cases 85 years ago, from shortwave transmissions. So what was it like during the war to be listening to the propaganda broadcasts of the Third Reich? Fortunately, there are a lot of off-air recordings of them. The famous ones were made by William Joyce, otherwise known as Lord Haw Haw, but there were many others, some of them more subtle and almost more, how could you put it, insidious. And many of those involved with producing them, including William Joyce and his female counterpart Axis Sally, were brought to justice at Nuremberg, or beforehand. In William Joyce's case, he was fairly quickly dispatched to the gallows. But here is a recording made in North America of a shortwave broadcast from Nazi Germany in 1942. And the content, particularly the anti-Jewish content, is not endorsed, repeat, not endorsed by VK3AML. But in the interests of this never happening again, it's very necessary to, once in a while, take a backwards look at that period and the huge mistakes that were made in allowing a national movement like the Nazi movement to get as far as it did before it was finally stopped by an international conflagration. A selection of Nazi propaganda broadcasts in the English language aimed at whittling down the morale of the English during World War II.
"70% of the national income had been spent on the war. This year, the cost of the war had meant 126 quid per head of the population." Now that gives us something to think about. We all know that this war has cost thousands of millions of pounds. And the great mystery is, where did all the money suddenly come from? In peacetime, there was never any money for vitally needed projects for the good of the nation. But when there is a war, as if by magic, the money suddenly becomes available. Why is that? Because the big bosses control the money. They control the banks which control the flow of money. It's mostly debt. That's to say, it only exists on paper. But they can juggle about with it as they please. In peacetime, they don't think it's worth their while to release more money. Profits can often be made better when money is tight. scarcity means high prices. Poverty of the millions means millions for the profiteers. That's why they've always arranged things so cutely, so that the poor stay poor and the rich get even richer. But when this war came along, first it was a big opportunity for making even greater profits. And secondly, it was in fact a war for the extension and strengthening of the capitalist system. Okay, for such a good cause, the money was certainly forthcoming. Last year, according to Halifax, they took 70% of the people's money away to pay for the war. That was excellent business. This year, every man jack was fined 126 quid. That's what it amounts to. Taxes have never been so high before. Money was mobilized to win a total victory for capitalism. And now we've nearly won that victory. But before we win it, mates, let's think over for a minute what we workers could have done with that money had we had it in peacetime. The money was there. It was always there. It was ours. We made it. But we couldn't get hold of it. If we could have turned this country of ours into a place where poverty and need was impossible.
And I must add here, this broadcast is not endorsed by VK3AML. This is a Nazi propaganda broadcast recorded off-air, off shortwave radio in 1942. To give some idea of what was going on. It was not all Heil Hitler. It was subtle stuff aimed at whittling down the morale of people or making them distrust each other. Didn't work terribly well, but it is interesting to listen to it.
But when we've won, we'll go back to a land of poverty and need. Halifax said so. And we've been warned often by others that this will be the case. There will be poverty for the people because capitalism will be on top. That is the victory that we are winning, workers. But we can change it. We can change it into a socialist victory by asserting our rights now, by putting a people's government into power. Then the money will be there, earned by the people, to be spent by the people, and for the good of the people. Workers, take action now to win a socialist victory.
Interesting how the Nazis were promoting socialism when so many of the communists who had opposed them in getting into power in the 1929 to 33 period were put into concentration camps and many of them exterminated. Anyway, that was what Nazi propaganda broadcasting was like in 1942. I'd next like to play a recording of the next stage in the war, which was, of course, the Normandy landings on the 6th of June 1944, D-Day. The Second World War was in many ways the first radio war, in that people sitting in their homes could actually hear events occurring as they occurred, or at least recordings made a few hours before the fact. Fortunately, there are a lot of recordings surviving, taken with portable disc cutting equipment. Yes, there was such stuff at the time, in June 1944. And that's what this documentary from BBC World Service is about.
Hello and welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Last. And today, using the actual broadcast from the time, we tell the story of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, as it was reported by the BBC.
This is Robin Duff, speaking from the first troop transport of this assault force. It's 20 minutes to 8 in the evening, a matter now of only a few hours to H hour. At noon today, we raised anchor, and we were ready to go. Slowly and majestically, as minesweepers and destroyers curved their way into position, we gave the lead to the other transports. Under a grey sky, we looked at the coast of Britain and watched it slowly grow more dim.
The 5th of June 1944, the evening before D-Day, more than 6,000 Allied naval craft, the largest armada the world had ever seen, left Britain heading for the heavily fortified Normandy coast. Their task was the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, the first crucial step in the liberation of Western Europe. The BBC had reporters attached to the invasion force, recording what they saw onto portable record players.
On the decks and in the holds, The soldiers were waiting. For the most part, they're standing about, looking out to sea, talking now and then, and thinking. In the wardroom, dinner. From the menu, soup, roast beef and green peas, and apples and cream. It might have been a crossing to Cherbourg in peacetime. And then you realized that your hand was moving just a little sluggishly to your mouth. Your tummy wasn't just where it usually was. The men around you were rather silent, and when they spoke, they were self-conscious. And now, as the time draws near for darkness, and we sail steadily nearer to the coastline of France, every man is wondering, every man is completely calm.
The attack would also come from the air. In the darkness, gliders packed with troops and planes carrying paratroopers took off from their bases in the south of England. Around 20,000 Allied troops were to land behind enemy lines ahead of the main seaborne invasion.
The first aircraft that is going to lead the very front in the early hours of tomorrow morning is turning onto the end of the tarmac to make its takeoff. And its wingtip light shining red and green over the heads of the dark, small figures of people on the aerodrome watching it take off. Taking off from here loaded with parachutists, and taking with it perhaps the hopes and the fears and the prayers of millions of people in this country who sleep tonight not knowing that this mighty operation is taking place. There she goes now, the first aircraft leading the attack on Europe.
Paratroops, steel helmeted, black-faced, festooned from head to feet, covered the long line of bucket seats on either side of the fuselage. We saw fires around us below on all sides. Our bombers had done their work. Our door opened. The time had come. We were over the target. I'd expected them to whoop battle cries, to raise the roof in that last second. But not a man of them did. They just stepped silently out into the red night.
This is Chester Wilmot broadcasting from a glider bound for France and invasion. Officers and men, all laden up with equipment so heavily that they can barely walk. But they've got to carry with them the means by which they can fight the moment they land. We've just crossed over the coast of France, and all around us along the coast, ack fire is going up, away to the right, away off to the left. And there now I can see the light which is to guide us in to our main landing zone.
Back out at sea, as dawn broke on the 6th of June, the enormous armada approached the French coast.
In 25 minutes' time, the assault on the beaches will begin. Overhead, the thunderous roar of fortresses and liberators going in to blast the coast. On the horizon, flash after flash from the guns of the bombarding ships. All around us are craft of every sort and kind. Hello, BBC. This is Michael Standing speaking from a Force Headquarters ship. We've seen these assault craft bouncing on the waves. There are white horses on the deep green sea now, and it's been a pretty uncomfortable journey for them into shore. And the moment they touch down, they've got to leap out and go into the assault. We, standing here, wish those boys who've gone in all the luck in the world.
This is the day and this is the hour. The sky is lightening over the coast of Europe as we go in. The sun is blazing down brightly now. It's almost like an omen, the way it suddenly come out just as we were going in. The whole sky is bright, the sea is a glittering mass of silver, with all these craft of every kind moving across it, and the great battleships in the background blazing away at the shore.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snagg. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communiqué number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Despite the bombardment from sea and air, many of the fortified German positions defending the beaches remained intact. The Allied troops faced devastating artillery and machine gun fire. The beaches were littered with mines. The losses were heavy. But by the end of June 6th, the Allies had secured the beachheads and had begun moving inland. That day, the Allies landed 156,000 men in northern France. Among them were BBC reporters who set up their equipment in the sand dunes and watched reinforcements arrive.
This is Alan Melville, Dispatch 13, 2100 hours, 6th of June, from the beach west of Ouistreham. Paratroops are landing. They're landing all around me as I speak. Red, white and blue parachutes fluttering down, and they're just about the best thing that we've seen for a good many hours. I can still see the signs of a typical Panzer battle being raged on the slightly high ground just about 3 or 4 miles ahead of me. Down they come. They're being attacked pretty harshly, as you'll hear, but they're landing in great force between the sand dunes, between the beach area and the battle, and they may have a very decisive effect on that battle. The aircraft are sweeping inland, and I'm just turning around to look out to sea, and I can see away out to the very horizon. They're coming in flood after flood.
On D-Day alone, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded or listed as missing. The Germans lost thousands, and many French civilians were casualties too. But as the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, knew and told the world that day, this was a turning point in the liberation of Western Europe and the final defeat of Nazi Germany.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
General Eisenhower, ending this edition of Witness History with me, Alex Last. We have hundreds more episodes for you to listen to on all sorts of subjects, so do have a browse in our archive. And we have specially curated collections on our website, including one all about the Second World War. Just search online for BBC Witness History. Hello and welcome.
Whoops, I mucked that up. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. We're playing recordings of radio related to the use of that medium at the end of and after the Second World War. And welcome to Graham Thomas, VK3DLW, on the streaming service. People who look us up there, you won't see a great deal, just an old chap operating a mixer and sitting in front of a microphone, basically. But we have a particularly good connection tonight. I think we've finally won the software battle, and it looks like most of the recordings are going through without too much distortion. Not too much distortion in addition to what they already had, being 80 years old. Graham is calling us from Selby in the Dandenongs. It's an interesting place with a radio connection that not too many people are aware of. Selby is a place where in the 1890s, a pioneer orchardist named G.W. Selby was based. The place was named after him. Pardon me. It's now a stopping point for the Puffing Billy Railway. G.W. Selby also had a very large house in Alma Road, Caulfield, and he was interested in electricity in the 1870s, 80s and 90s. Consequently, he built a generator at the end of the 1870s, one of the first in Melbourne. Later on, he was involved in 1896 with two electrical achievements. One was being only the second person in Melbourne to build an X-ray equipment and take X-rays. I actually have one here. I knew his son back in the 1970s. The other thing was that with virtually the same equipment, the high voltage spark coil, lengths of wire, he built his own coherer, and Selby was the first Australian radio ham. He, although they weren't known by that name at the time, in Caulfield he set up a transmitting antenna and a spark transmitter based on Marconi's original design. No tuned circuit, just directly connecting the spark gap to an antenna, which I suppose had some sort of broadly tuned characteristic. And he had a friend named Calder Oliver, an engineer, a hydraulic engineer. Calder Oliver was actually, this will sound like a joke, but it's not. Calder Oliver was the engineer in 1896 who was in charge of the Werribee sewage farm, which in those days was, believe it or not, one of the great engineering marvels of the domestic world. It was held up as an example of its type. In fact, Werribee Sewage Farm is still operating more or less on the same design principles that they established in the 1890s. But Calder Oliver was at the other end of that first series of radio transmissions. So G.W. Selby, I think, in Alma Road, Caulfield. Calder Oliver, I think, was in Brighton, about a mile or two away. And in 1896, they managed to exchange messages. And Selby's son, who I knew, recalled for me in a letter that his father had been called into a program on 3UZ in the 40s called 50 and Over, where people who were 50 and over would be called on to recall their achievements in life. And the announcer asked Selby what was the first Morse message ever sent by radio in Australia, and Selby apparently said, well, we were both very excited, so when I first got the movement of the Morse ticker activated by the coherer, I sent the message, "Watto, she bumps." And those were the first words ever transmitted by radio telegraphy in Australia. End of 1896, as far as I can tell. This is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test. Well, you've just heard D-Day, which was the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe successfully by the Allied forces under Eisenhower. And eventually they got into Germany. The Russians got in initially from the east, and Eisenhower's men, along with those of General Montgomery from the west. And, of course, they came across the concentration camps, and what a tale of woe that was. The world kind of knew that there were concentration camps there, but they didn't know the extent of the Holocaust until that time. When it was discovered, the scale of human destruction and degradation going on in those concentration camps, Eisenhower commanded as many of the newsreel units as were available in Europe at the time to go and record in detail all of the nastiest aspects of the concentration camps, of Buchenwald, Auschwitz, the gas chambers, the whole lot. And Eisenhower's rationale was that only by recording it in a way that could never be denied would there be a way of avoiding the Holocaust recurring in the future. So we have some excellent documentation of the opening of the concentration camps, including this broadcast by the famous American commentator Edward R. Murrow. This was never put to air. It was actually transmitted by shortwave radio from occupied Europe back to America for syndication, and was kept as a log. And it's only in recent years that we've been able to filter this to get rid of the heterodyne whistles, the hum, the noise, to make it listenable. So here in Ed Murrow's own words are his description of entering Buchenwald with the troops just unable to believe what they were seeing.
Permit me to tell you what you would have seen and heard had you been with me on Thursday. It will not be pleasant listening. If you're at lunch, or if you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio. For I propose to tell you of Buchenwald. It is on a small hill about 4 miles outside Weimar, and it was one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, and it was built to last. As we approached it, we saw about 100 men in civilian clothes with rifles advancing in open order across a field. There were a few shots. We stopped to inquire. We're told that some of the prisoners had a couple of SS men cornered in there. We drove on, reached the main gate. The prisoners crowded up behind the wire. We entered. And now let me tell this in the first person, for I was the least important person there, as you shall hear. There surged around me an evil-smelling horde. Men and boys reached out to touch me. They were in rags and the remnants of uniforms. Death had already marked many of them, but they were smiling with their eyes. I looked out over that mass of men to the green fields beyond, where well-fed Germans were plowing. A German, Fritz Kirchheimer, came up and said, "May I show you around the camp? I've been here 10 years. An Englishman stood to attention saying, "May I introduce myself? Delighted to see you. And can you tell me when some of our blokes will be along?" I told him soon, and asked to see one of the barracks. It happened to be occupied by Czechoslovakians. When I entered, men crowded around, tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told that this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it, 5 to a bunk. The stink was beyond all description. When I reached the center of the barracks, a man came up and said, "You remember me. I am Peter Zenkel, one-time mayor of Prague." I remembered him, but did not recognize him. He asked about Benish and Jan Masaryk. I asked how many men had died in that building during the last month. They called the doctor. We inspected his records. There were only names in the little black book, nothing more. Nothing who these men were, what they had done or hoped. Behind the names of those who had died, there was a cross. I counted them. They totaled 242. 242 out of 1,200 in 1 month. As I walked down to the end of the barracks, there was applause from the men too weak to get out of bed. It sounded like the hand clapping of babies. They were so weak. The doctor's name was Paul Heller. He had been there since '38. As we walked out into the courtyard, a man fell dead. 2 others, they must have been over 60, were crawling towards the latrine. I saw it, but will not describe it. In another part of the camp, they showed me the children, hundreds of them. Some were only 6. One rolled up his sleeve, showed me his number. It was tattooed on his arm. D6030 it was. The others showed me their numbers. They will carry them till they die. An elderly man standing beside me said, "The children, enemies of the state." I could see their ribs through their thin shirts. The old man said, "I am Professor Charles Richer of the Sorbonne." The children clung to my hands and stared. We crossed to the courtyard. Men kept coming up to speak to me and to touch me. Professors from Poland, doctors from Vienna, men from all Europe. Men from the countries that made America. We went to the hospital. It was full. The doctor told me that 200 had died the day before. I asked the cause of death. He shrugged and said, "Tuberculosis, starvation, fatigue, and there are many who have no desire to live. It is very difficult." Dr. Heller pulled back the blankets from a man's feet to show me how swollen they were. The man was dead. Most of the patients could not move. As we left the hospital, I drew out a leather billfold, hoping that I had some money which would help those who lived to get home. Professor Richer from the Sorbonne said, "I should be careful of my wallet if I were you. You know there are criminals in this camp, too." A small man tottered up saying, "May I feel the leather, please? You see, I used to make good things of leather in Vienna." Another man said, "My name is Walter Röder. For many years I lived in Joliet. Came back to Germany for a visit, and Hitler grabbed me." I asked to see the kitchen. It was clean. The German in charge had been a communist, had been at Buchenwald for 9 years, had a picture of his daughter in Hamburg, hadn't seen her for almost 12 years. And if I got to Hamburg, would I look her up? He showed me the daily ration, one piece of brown bread about as thick as your thumb. On top of it, a piece of margarine, as big as 3 sticks of chewing gum. That and a little stew was what they received every 24 hours. He had a chart on the wall, very complicated it was. There were little red tabs scattered through it. He said that was to indicate each 10 men who died. He had to account for the rations, and he added, "We're very efficient here." We went again into the courtyard, and as we walked, we talked. The 2 doctors, the Frenchman and the Czech, agreed that about 6,000 had died during March. Kirchenheimer, the German, added that back in the winter of '39, when the Poles began to arrive, without winter clothing, they died at the rate of approximately 900 a day. 5 different men asserted that Buchenwald was the best concentration camp in Germany. They had had some experience of the others. Dr. Heller, the Czech, asked if I would care to see the crematorium. He said it wouldn't be very interesting because the Germans had run out of coke some days ago and had taken to dumping the bodies into a great hole nearby. Professor Richer said, "Perhaps I would care to see the small courtyard." I said yes. He turned and told the children to stay behind. As we walked across the square, I noticed that the professor had a hole in his left shoe and a toe sticking out of the right one. He followed my eyes and said, "I regret that I am so little presentable, but what can one do?" At that point, another Frenchman came up to announce that 3 of his fellow countrymen outside had killed 3 SS men and taken 1 prisoner. We proceeded to the small courtyard. The wall was about 8 feet high. It adjoined what had been a stable or garage. We entered. It was floored with concrete. There were 2 rows of bodies stacked up like cordwood. They were thin and very white. Some of the bodies were terribly bruised, though there seemed to be little flesh to bruise. Some had been shot through the head, but they bled but little. All except 2 were naked. I tried to count them as best I could, and arrived at the conclusion that all that was mortal of more than 500 men and boys lay there in 2 neat piles. There was a German trailer, which must have contained another 50, but it wasn't possible to count them. The clothing was piled in a heap against the wall. It appeared that most of the men and boys had died of starvation. They had not been executed. But the manner of death seemed unimportant. Murder had been done at Buchenwald. God alone knows how many men and boys have died there during the last 12 years. Thursday, I was told that there were more than 20,000 in the camp. There had been as many as 60,000. Where are they now? As I left that camp, a Frenchman who used to work for Havas in Paris came up to me and said, "You will write something about this, perhaps." And he added, "To write about this, you must have been here at least 2 years. And after that, you don't want to write anymore." I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. Dead men are plentiful in war, but the living dead, more than 20,000 of them in one camp. And the country round about was pleasing to the eye, and the Germans were well fed and well dressed. American trucks were rolling towards the rear, filled with prisoners. Soon they would be eating American rations, as much for a meal as the men at Buchenwald received in 4 days. If I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I am not in the least sorry. I was there on Thursday, and many men and many tongues blessed the name of Roosevelt. For long years, his name had meant the full measure of their hope. These men, who had kept close company with death for many years, did not know that Mr. Roosevelt would, within hours, join their comrades who had laid their lives on the scales of freedom. Back in '41, Mr. Churchill said to me, with tears in his eyes, "One day the world and history will recognize and acknowledge what it owes to your president. I saw and heard the first installment of that at Buchenwald on Thursday. It came from men from all over Europe. Their faces, with more flesh on them, might have been found anywhere at home. To them, the name Roosevelt was a symbol, a code word for a lot of guys named Joe who were somewhere out in the blue with the armor heading east. At Buchenwald, they spoke of the president just before he died. If there be a better epitaph, history does not record it.
Edward R. Murrow, doing a report on the liberation of the concentration camps, in that case specifically Buchenwald, and who can add anything to that? I have often felt, in comparison with my parents who were born within the first 15 years of the 20th century, that I probably was born at the right time, avoiding the first half of the 20th century, 2 world wars and a major trade depression. One can't help but be sorry for people who are caught up with all of that. Of course, there are people still caught up in international troubles, no longer Australia, New Zealand, USA, but the Middle East, of course, which has been a cod case for 2,000 years. And no end in sight. This is VK3AML. I won't get too political. I'm trying to convey the value of spoken word recordings, which of course have been my business for most of my adult life. I did electrical engineering at Swinburne, diploma only, not a degree, back in 1973-74, and as soon as I got out into the workforce, Gough Whitlam and his media minister Moss Cass were opening up Access Radio 3ZZ and 3CR and community radio in general, and I used that as a stepping stone into commercial broadcasting. I found the writing and production side of radio far more attractive than wielding a soldering iron, although I still enjoy that very much as a hobby. Otherwise I wouldn't be here on amateur radio. Amateur radio is an excellent hobby. I hope that's conveyed to the people on the YouTube stream as much as it's conveyed on the air. It certainly has kept me interested for more than 50 years, probably about 55 at this stage. In connection with this, the next recording, the next program, is particularly interesting. 9/11 was not the first occasion on which an aeroplane had flown into a skyscraper building in New York. The first instance of it was in July 1945, right at the end of the war, just after that last recording was made, when a B-25 bomber, disoriented in fog, was mistakenly flying up Park Avenue in a thick fog and hit the Empire State Building on the 80th of its 86 floors. People were killed, but the building was intact. But interestingly, somebody was running a dictating machine and actually managed to get the sound of the whole thing recorded, which you'll hear. This program is one of a series called How Sound. It's made for the public broadcasting system in America. Most of the programs are on aspects of making radio programs, how to make them with sound effects, how to effectively interview people. This particular program is on the effective usage of archival materials. So I can't help but cheer that finally somebody has got the message that all of the preservation work that people like me have done over the last 50 years should be accessed and used. So, on to How Sound, talking about the Empire State Building disaster of 28th July 1945. This is VK3AML with a regular Saturday night test, and at 11 p.m. we'll open up, hopefully, for a discussion on air on 147.475 megahertz. If you want to look in on the stream, if you have trouble with the audio, or if the radio transmission is not covering you adequately, if there's noise there, you could try looking us up on the digital stream on YouTube Live. Look for VK3AML 12 June 2021. Feed in the phrase VK3AML 12 June 2021, and you should get us. And I note, looking at my software here, if I can, that we have no dropped frames at all this week. The stream has been completely continuous, which absolutely floors me in view of the beating that the interconnects on Melbourne's internet system got in the storm on Thursday night. How sound? The B-25 bomber that crashed into the Empire State Building, 1945.
From PRX, the Public Radio Exchange, this is How Sound. I'm Rob Rosenthal, host of How Sound, the backstory to great radio storytelling. Here's something that makes me scratch my head. The 20th century was a recorded century. From cylinders to digital recorders, the last century was captured in sound. I read an estimate somewhere that the Library of Congress alone has over 3 million sound recordings. 3 million. Yet, on the radio today, you rarely hear archive tape. Okay, music recordings might be an exception if you want to think of those recorded songs as archival recordings. But oral histories, news, odd bits and bytes of sound, old spoken word albums, you rarely hear them.
I just love archival tape.
Fortunately, producer Joe Richmond likes to get his hands dirty, rummaging through archives and poring through online audio collections.
I just love dealing with it and playing with it in the story and listening to it. For me, it's like, it gives you that kind of transporting quality that I look for in radio in general.
Joe may be best known for his radio diaries. In fact, that's the name of his company, Radio Diaries. For many years, Joe handed tape decks to people so they could document their lives. He also produces stories where, instead of loaning a recorder, he's making all of the recordings, but the final piece still sounds like a diary of sorts. Well, most recently, he's produced documentaries that use a lot of archive tape. Joe says his most ambitious project was Mandela, an audio story, a 5-part series that aired on All Things Considered in 2004. He collected nearly 200 hours of archive tape.
My favorite archival experience of my life was being in South Africa working on our Mandela series and having just unlimited access to the basement of the SABC, the public broadcaster in South Africa, and being able to just go through all these old reel-to-reel recordings and just dub right there, and just stumbling on, just strange things like Afrikaans lessons that were broadcast on the radio.
Teach yourself Afrikaans.
Good evening, listeners. Let us start off by getting to know all the Afrikaans sounds. Lag, dag en nacht.
And a very historic recording that we stumbled on of the prosecutor of Mandela's Rivonia trial in the 60s, a recording of his opening statement that no one had ever heard before, which was on a reel-to-reel tape that was literally falling apart every few seconds as I was playing it on the reel-to-reel machine. I had to borrow a razor blade and splicing tape, and I had to fix all these splices just to be able to listen to it. And it was this mislabeled old reel-to-reel tape that no one had really heard before since I think the time it was recorded.
Firstly, the state alleges the planned purpose thereof was to bring about chaos, disorder, and turmoil in the battle to be waged against the white man in this country.
It's those kind of moments where if you can manage to get yourself into an actual archive, it's just like the possibility for finding things that have not been found before is really exciting.
On this How Sound, we'll listen to a piece Joe produced about a ridiculously unlikely airplane crash. In 1945, an American B-25 bomber hit the Empire State Building. Joe says he had this story on his to-do list for a really long time, but he never really did anything with it until he heard about a stunning archival recording.
There was a guy in a building as the plane was going down Fifth Avenue who saw the plane and happened to be dictating the letter into his old dictation machine. And, you know, even though the sound isn't very good, you can't really tell what's happening. There is this kind of documentation of that moment when the plane is going down the valley of office towers, down Fifth Avenue, on its way to the Empire State Building.
Listen carefully, and you'll hear Yeager say, "A letter to Dean Crawford, University of Michigan. Dear Dean Crawford, we are sending under separate cover," and then the crash.
Dean Crawford. We are sending under separate cover.
Let's listen to the whole story. The Plane That Flew into the Empire State Building by Joe Richman.
My name is Therese Fortier-Willig. In 1945, I was 20 years old, and I worked for Catholic Relief Services on the 79th floor of the Empire State Building.
My name is Gloria Paul. In 1945, I was working for the USO headquarters. I was on the 56th floor of the Empire State Building. It was just exciting. Every time I got off the train and went up to that 56th floor, there was excitement. It was the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world at that time.
Rising a quarter of a mile straight up into the clouds, the world's tallest structure, the Empire State Building. From an observation platform, visitors look down on the New York skyline, 1,200 feet below.
Everyone on the ground looked so small. The cars, the people. You were really part of the clouds.
The Empire State Building, a giant of steel and stone, a mark of 20th century progress.
I'm Arthur Weingarten. I wrote the book The Sky is Falling, about the B-25 bomber that crashed into the Empire State Building. The pilot of the plane was Captain William Franklin Smith, a highly decorated pilot. Early in the morning on July 28, 1945, Captain Smith left from Massachusetts to the New York area.
That morning was a misty, cloudy day at the Empire State Building. We couldn't really see the ground from the 79th floor.
And it was so foggy outside, I was looking out of the window, there was nothing to see. It was just like pea soup. It was like a London fog.
It was very foggy in New York this morning when an Army B-25 twin-engine bomber passed over LaGuardia Field and asked for a weather report.
When Captain Smith called into LaGuardia Field and said, "I request clearance to land," the tower said, "We have almost zero visibility here. I suggest you do not land here at LaGuardia."
The pilot was warned that the weather was bad and that the tower of the Empire State Building, a landmark for airmen in this area, could not be seen.
Smith said, "Thank you very much," and signed off. He ignored it. After over 50 missions in Europe, flying in the worst weather conditions imaginable, what could possibly happen to him here in the United States? And so he started to make a little bit of a turn, which brought him over Midtown Manhattan. And as he started to straighten out, the clouds broke up enough for him to realize he was flying among skyscrapers.
On a foggy Saturday morning, 5 blocks north of the Empire State Building, James E. Yeager was dictating into his soundscriber machine a letter to Dean Crawford of the University of Michigan.
Letter to Dean Crawford, University of Michigan.
He was interrupted by the sound of a plane roaring down Fifth Avenue at less than 1,000 feet.
And you can hear him on the tape dictating the letter as the sound of the engines get louder and louder and louder as it passes by his office window. Suddenly his voice stops, and a second or so later, on the tape, you hear a dull thud, which is the impact of the bomber into the Empire State Building.
At about 5 minutes of 10, I got up from my desk, and that was the end of the office as it existed.
We are delaying the start of our regularly scheduled program to bring you a special news report on the crash of an airplane into the Empire State Building. Columbia stations
I was at the file cabinet, and all of a sudden the building felt like it was going to just topple right over. It just threw me across the room, and I landed against the wall. People were screaming and looking at each other and didn't know what to do. We didn't know whether it was a bomb or what happened.
A B-25 Mitchell bomber on a flight, apparently a routine flight from Boston to Newark or New York City, crashed into the 78th or the 79th story of the Empire State Building, and what the final toll will be, there is no way of telling at this time.
On the other side of the office, all I could see was flames. Mr. Fountain was walking through the office when the plane hit the building, and he was on fire. His clothes were on fire, his head was on fire. 6 of us managed to get into this one office that seemed to be untouched by the fire and close the door before it engulfed us. There was no doubt that the other people must have been killed.
The 4-alarm fire has drawn every piece of fire apparatus to the busy scene of 5th Avenue and 34th Street in the heart of Manhattan, and hundreds of office workers were trapped a fifth of a mile above the street level.
It was a very small universe at that point. You're sort of stuck there in an island with fire all around us. A couple of the women had passed out from the smoke, and I had a handkerchief in my pocket, and so I used that to cover my nose and mouth to protect me from the fumes. But I didn't expect to get out alive. Somebody opened the window, and I'm sitting there, and I thought about my rings, and I figured somebody else might as well have use out of them. So I took them off my fingers and threw them out the window.
We have contacted an eyewitness, Mr. Phil Kirby of the Grant Advertising Agency. We've contacted him by telephone. Mr. Kirby.
I looked out of the window, and it was very, very smoky, terribly smoky. And I looked out of the window, and I saw 2 girls trapped on the 78th floor. That's above our floor. You see, I'm on the 76th. There's 2 flights up.
A man appeared, a few stories down. He looked up and he signaled up to us. And I think Charlotte was sitting, with her legs dangling inside the office, and we were holding on to her. It gave her a better view of what was going on.
Then one girl got out of the window, and I said, get back, get back, get back. I said, the fireman will be here soon.
Yeah.
So she said, well, come quickly because our whole office is in flames.
Yes.
Can't wait long. And I said, all right, you get back now. Be a good girl and get back.
I guess he was trying to give us a little solace that I know that you're there, don't worry, And
I'll interrupt this to say this is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test transmission at 11 p.m. in about 15 minutes' time. We'll be opening up on 147.475 for discussions. If anybody would like to come up and have a chat about what we've been playing, the use of archival audio, anything to do with restoration, you name it, it's up to you. Oh, good heavens, we've got Steve Haynes on the line, and Steve is one of the radio inspectors, so I have to mind me P's and Q's. Thanks, Steve. I'm trying to minimise the amount of music on this stuff. Keep it to spoken word, keep it to material involving the radio medium to make it pertinent. Hopefully it'll be of interest to the average radio ham. And if you can't receive us via VHF, the stream is always there. Look for VK3AML 12 June 2021 on YouTube Live, and the audio there should be quite good. Tonight we have an excellent connection, which really surprises me because of the amount of damage done to Melbourne's internet infrastructure by the storm on Thursday night. On Thursday night we actually tried to stream our EasyPal digital slow scan net, and it was almost disastrous. We got 20 minutes worth through on 2 occasions, and in both occasions the the stream failed. This is VK3AML testing. Back to the transmission back to the program on the disaster at the Empire State Building, 28th of July 1945. The first time a plane had flown into a building in New York.
That was a connection with the rest of the world, you know. We all felt a little better to know that someone knew we were there.
When the plane hit the outside of the building, it kept on going, and the engines continued about 20 feet into the building and went down through the elevator shaft, what was an elevator shaft.
When the plane hit, parts of the engine flew ahead and severed the lifting cables of the elevators that had been at the 79th floor. Sitting in one of the elevators was a young 19-year-old elevator operator named Betty Lou Oliver. She started to plunge down the elevator shaft from the 79th floor.
Cables of two of the cars were sheared, sending both elevators crashing to the sub-basements of the Empire State Building. So far as
she was alive. She broke her pelvis and her back and her neck, but she survived.
Now, Reverend John J. Morrison has just come in, and he has just given the last rites to a man who jumped and landed on a parapet. I think it's on the 65th or 66th floor. It's down below us anyway.
Yes, I see.
My name is Sharon Deering Sizoskis. My father was Paul Deering. My father was in a corner office on the 79th floor. He either was forced out by the crash and the concussion, or he actually had to jump when he saw the whole place on fire. It's more likely that he had to jump. You know, if you were ever up 79 floors and looking down, to think of someone having to jump out of a window up there, that's what I think of.
We're speaking from the Empire State Building, near the top of the building, the 79th floor, where firemen are picking up the debris caused by the crash of a Mitchell B-25 bomber into this building right about 40 feet from where we stand.
All of a sudden, here were firemen, and they're coming to rescue us, you know, all dressed up in their raincoats and whatever they wear, you know, it was just wonderful. We climbed out through the broken glass. I was just grateful to be alive.
The walls are still hot. The brick and stone walls that we have our hand on as we talk are still hot with the flame that has been out for over an hour now.
112 flights later, we got to the bottom floor, but we didn't know what happened until we came out of the building. I see crowds of people all kind of looking at each other. I said, well, what happened? What happened? What happened? And he pointed up to the 79th floor, and I saw the tail of a B-25 sticking out.
Well, we're going to get off the air here very shortly because we have the story told now. The B-25 two-engine Army bomber crashing into the Empire State Building just a few minutes before 10 o'clock.
That morning, 11 people died in the offices and 3 in the plane, for a total of 14 people.
Well, this is Don Goddard, and this is the National Broadcasting Company.
We return you now to the music of the first piano quartet.
Joe Richmond produced that story for National Public Radio in 2008. It's called The Plane That Flew into the Empire State Building. This is How Sound, the backstory to great radio storytelling. I'm Rob Rosenthal. Joe says there's no substitute for hunting for audio in an actual archive, but the internet is a close second. The problem is, online recordings are sometimes compromised.
Because the stuff that you get online, or the stuff that you'll get from sources that have already been kind of collected and curated, have been, they've been edited, they've been curated, they've been kind of like picked. And the real problem is when you have archival audio that's been, compressed and processed and gone around the internet a number of times and been copied that way, so that it feels like it just has that echoey, tinny quality of compression. And those are then it's stuff that you can't really fix that.
Poking around archives and the internet in search of sound makes sense, right? I mean, where else would you look? Yard sales? Well, Joe did something that never would have occurred to me.
One of the things that we did is Samar Freemark, my co-producer on the story, just sent emails to a lot of audio collectors. World War II era is a great period for looking for audio because everyone kind of collected and kept it. And so sometimes going right to collectors is a really good source. People will gladly let you listen and broadcast material if you give them some sort of credit and thanks. And so I think a lot of the material we used for this particular story came from individual audio collectors.
Some archival material is in the public domain. There are no copyright issues to navigate. You're free to use the recording. In other cases, you have to pay copyright owners for use. But Joe thinks, generally speaking, his work is covered by the Copyright Act's Fair Use Clause. Fair use basically says, and keep in mind, I ain't no lawyer, but fair use says so long as you are only using a portion of the work, so long as you are not impeding the ability of the copyright holder to make money from their work, and the use is for educational purposes, you're free to excerpt and use content.
On the NPR News magazines, we have the advantage of sort of, I guess you could say, being covered by fair use. It's, at least I consider our documentaries sort of covered under fair use laws, which means that we can use a reasonable amount of it. We're not selling them; they're for educational purposes. All these kind of somewhat vague criteria that sort of let you go under the umbrella of fair use. So we don't worry too much about rights.
Before we check out of today's program, I just want to return to one last bit of tape from Joe's Empire State Building story. Did you catch this?
We have contacted an eyewitness, Mr. Phil Kirby of the Grant Advertising Agency. We've contacted him by telephone. Mr. Kirby.
I looked out of the window, and it was very, very smoky, terribly smoky. And I looked out of the window, and I saw two girls trapped on the 78th floor. That's above our floor. You see, I'm in the 76th. There's 2 flights up.
A man appeared, a few stories down. He looked up and he signaled up to us. And I think Charlotte was sitting, with her legs dangling inside the office, and we were holding on to her. It gave her a better view of what was going on.
Then one girl got out of the window, and I said, get back, get back, get back. I said, the fireman will be here soon.
Yeah.
So she said, well, come quickly because our whole office is in flames.
Yes.
Can't wait long. And I said, all right, you get back now. Be a good girl and get back.
I guess he was trying to give us a little solace that I know that you're there, don't worry, And that was a connection with the rest of the world, We all felt a little better to know that someone knew we were there.
Doesn't that make you blink? Joe mixes an archival eyewitness account of a woman halfway out a window with interview tape of that woman. I mean, what are the odds Joe could find both the news account and the woman referred to in that tape? 60 years later, mind you.
Well, that was just getting lucky. We interviewed her and got that story before we heard the archival tape. So we had the story of them being trapped and looking out the window, opening the window for air and looking out, trying to see what was going on. And luckily she talked about seeing a man below, saying, get back in the window, that stuff. And we had that story, and then as we're going through all the archival tape, we stumbled on the guy looking up. That was just lucky.
That's when you think there's a radio god.
It's all about getting lucky, right? Whether you're interviewing someone or recording scenes or going through archives, it's all about just looking for stuff that makes you get excited and kind of fall in love with moments in the tape and give you the energy to kind of keep going.
Radio producer Joe Richmond.
The How Sound series made for National Public Radio in America, the equivalent of our 3CR or community radio here, and a very interesting series. It might be worth your while to look it up. You can find the whole series of, I think, well over 100 programs now that have been produced over a 12-year period, called How Sound, HOWSOUND, and they're well worth a look for anybody who's interested in the manipulation of sound or mixing, the usage of radio for persuasive purposes, the usage of radio in terms of audio restoration. A lot of very valuable stuff there. The internet is becoming a kind of a field of nuggets. unfortunately, you have to wade through a lot of dross to get to them. There's a lot of, primary or high school level production, quite often done by mature people who should know better, dealing with things like free energy and perpetual motion machines. I'd like a cent for every one of those that I've seen. Yet you try to follow the explanations and they end up being complete nonsense. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. We're also streaming live on YouTube. If you look up VK3AML, 12 June 2021, that's Google VK3AML 12 June 2021. If you're outside our VHF range on 2 metres, we are transmitting on 147.475, as we normally do, as Steve 3SL does on Friday nights and Dave 3ASC does most Wednesdays. Steve deals with his area of expertise. Mine is largely archival audio, and I have had to fiddle quite a few of these recordings to make them of a quality suitable for transmission. The recording, for example, of I blanked on his name, American commentator Edward R. Murrow, was so marred with hum I had to comb filter it for 60 hertz and harmonics. It was broadcast from Britain, where they had 50 hertz and harmonics as well, so that had to be comb filtered. There were then multiple recorded heterodynes from numerous adjacent HF transmissions, and I could filter those with a notch filter. And then, of course, you have to flatten the frequency response, because you've got the playback and recording on disc at the European end, and the playback and recording on disc at the American end, where they were receiving the shortwave transmission. It's a wonder, really, that there's anything left of the bloody broadcast. But it's survived for more than 70 years, closer to 80 years now. Archival audio, as was pointed out in that House Sound episode, quite often we hear archival audio of music, but considering the enormous amount of it that's available, archival transmissions of spoken word are few and far between. It's 11:01 p.m, so I will open now. If anybody's interested to chat on 147.475, I hope this has stimulated a few ideas. So, checking that I've got the level up there. This is VK3AML, now going over the receiver on 147.475. Do we have any people who'd like to call in?
VK3ACZ.
Hello, Peter. VK3ACZ. Yeah, hope that all went down okay. And how are things with you? I know that you're out in Baronia, and they've had quite a bit of wind damage up in the Dandenongs. Are you still on power and everything? VK3ACZ, with a pause in case we have any other breakers. VK3AML.
And VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
And VK3CAE in Riddles Creek.
Acknowledging VK3CG and VK3CAE. Very good. Well, first of all, we'll take Peter and then move on to ECG and CAE. And you're coming in well from Riddles Creek. VK3ACZ to take, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ, the usual Saturday night broadcast. Thank you very much for the broadcast, Chris. I'll describe but most of it as chilling, not a criticism, an observation. I'm glad you started with the comedy items first, because it wouldn't work quite so well the other way around. I think once we've been once we've been exposed to that, it's better to, it would have been better to have the laughs at the start, which they were. And by the way, I'm rather concerned about my finger exploding from too much static electricity all over the carpet. Hi. That was very good. The Nazi propaganda one, well, like I said, chilling. Good that you stated from the outset that they weren't the views reflected in VK3AML's broadcast. Hi. And I suppose the Buchenwald was just, that was the real chilling one. That was the one that made me think, man, if I was there, how could I ever be the same again? And I thought the narrator did a terrific job describing the carnage, describing the horror of the whole situation. The Empire State Building, when I was there in, when was it? 2004, the first time. Funny thing, I went up the top there and I spent a few hours. I watched the sunset, and that first time. When I went back the second time, about 18 months later, took XYL with me. I developed what I didn't realise at the time, but eventually was PTSD, and couldn't handle the heights all of a sudden. So I got up to the top, held on to the railings, and quickly scampered my way down. And the third and fourth times I was in New York, I stayed down the bottom while I watched family members go up Empire State Building. But I can report that there's a very nice plaque, not overdone. I find at times that people from that country are prone to not so much exaggerate things, but really labour on them. I thought it was quite respectable and tasteful. And that includes the 9/11 memorials. I think the last time I was there, the Freedom Tower might have only been about 30 stories high. But it was just sobering, and that's how I describe being at the Empire State Building. But I can report, in case you've not been there, that there's a plaque commemorating the event and all that. But anyway, good to have David on board. Good evening, David, 3ECG. Not going to forget that call sign. And I can't remember, is it Chris out there at Riddles Creek? Anyway, Chris was coming through about a strength 4 with me. Anyway, enough comments to start about the terrific broadcast tonight. Oh, just you mentioned the storms and all that, not affected here in Baronia. Jim, 3AMN, at Upway, was running his generator. He had no power and thought that he'd be without power for quite a few days. I think they'd said something like about probably not before Wednesday. Some dramas, and note that all the repeaters, 2 metre and 70 centimetre repeaters up in the Dandenongs are offline. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ.
Yeah, thanks for that. Pete. I feel very sorry for the people who are up in the Dandenongs having to put up with all of that. And I don't know whether you saw the television tonight. There's a lady there who had a home, mountain ash, a really big one, had come down fair through the middle of the house. Fortunately, nobody killed, which had destroyed not only her dwelling but her means of income, because she ran a creche from there, a child minding group. So she was in tears. House was literally destroyed. And the same went for many of the houses up there. The roads were blocked. Constant sound up there, apparently, of chainsaws all through the day, and I suspect there will be for several days. That's why I'm really surprised that this internet streaming is working so well. This is the first week I've had absolutely no drop frames at all on the stream. It's a combination. I've done a lot of work on the making the software compatible with the stream, which has taken a bit of fiddling, finding the right definition, the right repetition rate, the right coding, the number of permutations and combinations of that you can do are just legion. Anyway, I'll hand it round to VK3ECG, and I've just forgotten your handle, so you better give that to us. I hope there was some stuff of interest to you there too. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, good evening, Chris. The name is David again. David. Yes. So, yeah, fascinating. Really enjoyed that, and a nice sort of comedy at the beginning there. I like the tube as well, and the demonstration of that. I always remember, I think it was VK3DOC, Morris, who built a theremin using an old camera tube as one of the antennas. It was a very impressive looking device, even if his musical playing of it wasn't as good as his keyboard playing. But there we go. Yeah, fascinating. And the plane issue is really interesting because there was quite an interesting sort of historical debate with a lot of conspiracy theorists coming out, of course, in comparing and contrasting the Twin Towers with the Empire State Building issue. And of course there were absolutely huge differences between the types of aircraft and the construction of the building as to why the Empire State Building stayed up. People think of these bombers as being huge planes, but in fact, compared with most modern commercial planes, they were actually very small, very light. The plane was travelling at a very slow speed comparatively and had very little fuel on board by the time it was coming to land compared to the jets and so on. And the construction, of course, the building was very, very different. And remember, there's wonderful archival footage of the building being built, and that sort of honeycomb grid construction, which the outer part of the building just sort of hung off. Whereas I think the Twin Towers, the skin of the building was actually part of the structural frame as well. So really interesting differences about building design and plane designs and the different outcome that comes out of that. But yeah, it's obviously terrible and appalling sorts of disasters that occur. And of course, in my role, at times I've been involved with many of those sorts of things, which have their own challenges, of course. Anyway, I'm not sure I can hear Chris from Riddles Creek, so I'll pass it back to you, Chris, and first, and I'll sit and listen. So VK3AML from VK3 ECG, listening out for everyone.
No worries, Dave. I left a bit of a gap there in case anybody wanted to call in. Yeah, as I understand it, the Empire State Building had a central supporting column. The outer walls were just curtain walls, so consequently the plane would hit the outer wall, destroy a lot of the structure into the central column, but probably didn't do much damage to the column, which is why the Empire State Building was unaffected. Whereas the Twin Towers had revolutionary construction. They had a steel outer frame, and the exterior walls actually held the building up. So with somebody who were diabolically inclined, as Bin Laden and his cohorts were, to work out a way to crash a plane into the side of the structural wall of the Twin Towers, particularly a plane that had just taken off with an intercontinental amount of fuel on board, was really horrendous. I remember being up that night. I think it was late night our time. This all happened about 10 o'clock at night, and I walked into the lounge room and saw the TV transmission of it after the first tower had been destroyed, and it all looked like a science fiction serial being presented, and it took me a while to register that it was real. And then I must say I freaked out and just got glued to that television set for the rest of the night, as many people were. And I imagine people were glued to their radios when that happened in New York, particularly after, 6 years of war? Or 4 years of war in the case of America. They're always late for wars, aren't they? Apologies to any Americans listening in. Anyway, over to VK3CAE. Chris, how are you getting us tonight? VK3AML, with a pause in case anyone wants to break.
3DLW.
Acknowledge DLW. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, okay, I won't hold it because I doubt many of the others on the frequency can hear me all that comfortably. I can just hear, I think it's David VK3ECG with the notable call sign there. I can just hear him above the mute. Peter's about S3 here, you're about an S3. With the preamp, everyone's about an S7, other than David. And I've been on the chainsaw all day myself, actually, assisting, well, clearing my own yard earlier this morning and assisting the neighbours here because we had a lot of carnage happen in the Macedon Ranges, but nothing like up in the Dandenong Ranges. And nearby here out at Trentham, we've had some carnage as well. So hasn't been a good week for a lot of people. And thanks for the transmissions. Carnage in Empire State Building. And yes, I remember that evening. It was September 11 in 2001 in America. Relating back to the Empire State, much earlier incident. So I'll hand it back to you, Chris. I won't hold it any longer because I don't think many on the frequency will be able to hear me all that comfortably. So thanks again, Chris, VK3AML from VK3CAE.
Yeah, you're quite copyable here, Chris, and I've been streaming you onto the internet stream, so whoever can't receive you via radio would have been hearing you there quite well. In fact, you're a hell of a lot better this time than I've heard you on previous occasions. Don't know whether you've modified your antenna or something, but certainly it's an improvement. Could be the antenna here, I don't know. I've done a little bit of changing of feed lines and stuff, so all very good. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about the amount of work that's created for you out there, at least in Riddles Creek area. Most of it's open forest. There are spaces between the trees which will allow you a bit of space, a little bit of manoeuvring room. But from what I've seen of some of the scenes, Ferny Creek and Sassafras and Alinda, up in the Dandenongs, it's really a tangle. In some of the places, it's a complete tangled mess. Not only can they find it difficult to untangle the trees, which unfortunately have a nasty habit of springing up after they're cut, which makes them doubly dangerous. But even the roads to get in there have fallen trees across them. So it's when you live in the beautiful green Dandenongs, with both bushfires in summer and this in winter, it's there's certainly a trade-off. Anyway, over to VK3DLW. I think it's Dave 3DLW, VK3AML.
Yeah, Roger, Chris, it's Graham. Graham, as my ex-YL likes to say. Yeah, VK3AML, VK3DLW in the group. Yeah, Roger, it was particularly interesting to me because I always had interest in Edward R. Murrow as a radio commentator, and there was a very good movie that I think George Clooney and David Strathairn starred as Edward R. Murrow some years ago, that used his signature sign-off as a title, which was Good Night and Good Luck. Which is very, very highly rated, so you might know whether you've seen it, but it covers his period when he was particularly critical of Joseph McCarthy. So it's it's always interesting to follow his career. I hadn't realised that he'd been so involved as a war correspondent, particularly in the concentration camps. So look, we escaped pretty luckily up here. It was a strange storm here. We normally get a lot of wind against the house, but it must be because of the direction it came. We could hear it a lot in the trees, but we had very few gusts actually hit the house. Unfortunately, we're not surrounded by native trees. We've got a couple of big deciduous trees out the front that are liquid ambers, but at this stage, of course, they've all lost their leaves, so they haven't got so much surface area. We did lose one branch off a tree that my 40-metre wire Yagi's attached to, but amazingly it missed the pergola, it missed a new tree we planted, and it didn't take down any antennas, so we've been extremely lucky. We have got friends who, I think they featured on Channel 9, the friends of ours, and they had a tree come down and take out 3 cars all at once, just from one tree. So it's, there's some pretty horrific stories. And as far as I can see, looking at the power restoration or AusNet's outage site, I suspect Jim may not get power back till about Thursday or Friday. Maybe they'll do better than that, but they were originally saying tomorrow, but now they're saying, I think, the 17th and 18th for a lot of places. And our daughter's in Monbulk, and it doesn't sound like she's going to get power back till Thursday, as they're currently calling it anyway. So the damage to the infrastructure must be pretty substantial. We haven't been up there. It's not very safe to travel on the roads just at the moment anyway. Anyway, I'll pass it back, Chris. And look, thanks for all those recordings. They're really fascinating. And I don't know whether you got the 30 seconds over New York reference that I made on the stream. The stream here, it's probably the network here on my computer, but it's running, I don't know, perhaps 30 seconds to a minute behind the actual live broadcast on 2 Meters FM. So that's why I was a bit late joining. By the time I turned down the YouTube feed, the callback was already well underway. Anyway, I'll make this a final and just say thanks very much. Really appreciate it, and good night and good luck. VK3AML, VK3DLW.
VK3DLW, VK3AML. Thanks for that, Graham. While the COVID lockdown was on last year, and Dave 3ASC had vacated his usual Saturday night transmission, I thought, well, somebody should occupy the night, particularly with a captive audience. But hopefully there'll be some continuity to this. It's interesting. Ham radio is a hobby which has boundaries, legal and technical, that I think are only just starting to be explored properly. And one of the boundaries, of course, legally in our country, we may be very limited in the amount of power that we can run compared to other countries. I mean, I think you can run 2 kilowatts in New Zealand on HF. In America, you can certainly run 2 kilowatts. Here, it's, 400 watts of sideband without a permit. But compared to other countries, the regulations, now that the Radio Communications Act is in force rather than the old Wireless Telegraphy Act, there have been a lot of changes to the Act, which were purely practical. This now being a nation where the Postmaster General's Department is not in charge of all communication anymore. It's not a monopoly anymore, as it was in the 70s. There are multiple commercial carriers. There's internet, where third-party streaming is implicit in every web-based software-defined radio. So the idea of stuff not being streamed from a radio onto the internet is now unenforceable. There are something like 3,000 web-based SDRs of various forms around the world, on any one of which you can listen to a given frequency on radio, record it. And fortunately, we have a Radio Communications Act that takes that into account. I know with music, for instance, the music restriction that was so heavily enforced in the 1970s when things were a lot more draconian. The new Act refers to entertainment being banned. and consequently I try to keep to documentary material or material of an instructive nature, how to or how it was done rather than how to do it, and how you define entertainment is an interesting one. It's a word that could be applied in any number of ways. I think the reason that the restriction is there on entertainment, and somebody might correct me here, but it's to avoid competition with commercial broadcasters. That was, as I understand it, from the old-timers I used to speak to in the 70s, who actually were transmitting music pre-war quite legally, that the commercials, the Federation of Australian Radio Broadcasters, complained, and consequently the right to play music was not returned to Australian hams after the war. Now that's been eased up, and I believe that there are a number of things behind it. One was that the people on the ATV repeater found that they couldn't run instructional videos on the ATV repeater because most instructional videos are commercial and they have a music backing track, and you can't play the sound without the music backing. So that was allowed there. The other thing is on news broadcasts, the WIA, RASA, various other news broadcasts, they frequently use bridging music to separate one segment from another, or to separate one set of ideas from another, and it's quite a viable way of doing things. So I think we should be thankful that we live in a time when the laws are not quite so draconian as they were in the 70s. Frequently I come across old-timers who think that the Wireless Telegraphy Act still applies. They signed the Official Secrets Act for stuff being transmitted on shortwave. They weren't allowed to divulge the communications they heard on shortwave. Well, isn't that ridiculous now? Now if people want to hide stuff that they transmit on shortwave, they have frequency hopping, they have encoding. If they want it to be secret, they can make it secret. So really those sort of draconian restrictions, it's been interesting to see the progress of that, and I think Australia has been a little bit easier than most places, perhaps also because there are so few people using the bands. If you tune into 80 metres, for example, any night of the week after about 9 p.m, you'd be lucky to hear more than 2 sideband stations operating within Australia. There's plenty of space up there. In fact, I'm looking at getting a digital HF transceiver going to simultaneously put this out on 80 metres. I want a band that doesn't normally get received outside the national boundaries of Australia. It might reach New Zealand, but very few other places. And 80 metres would seem to me to be a good place to act as a complement to the coverage of 2 metres. Sorry, I've been raving far too long. Thank you, Graham, for coming up. And thank you to Chris also in Riddles Creek. Nice to hear a bit of DX there on 2 metres. And to hear it come through so well, as you will hear, Chris, if you listen on the replay of the YouTube live clip. We go back then to Peter at the top of the list. I'm sorry to have spent so much time replying, but I think it was necessary. Peter, VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. Just left a little pause in case we had any other joiners. And Chris up there at Riddles Creek, good copy here. You're smashing it in really well. Graham, oh, by the way, yeah, you've met Graham. He's a member of the Sherbrooke Radio Club, in case you hadn't joined the dots there, Chris. 3DLW, and that was some interesting stuff you said about Selby too, that must have come off the top of your head just with a mention of the place Selby. That was pretty good. And not to disappoint you about coverage, but I often get on the SDRs when Clint, 3CSJ, who broadcasts on Friday night 3541 as the astronomy broadcast at 3 Echo Kilo Hotel, I've heard him on the west coast of the US, and I think he runs 100 whiskey. I've also heard him on an SDR in Hawaii, although that's often drowned out by local stuff, so you'd probably get out more than Australia is what I'm trying to say from that. And, Professor David, you were about 25 over 9 here, not that we're all that far away anyhow. And Chris, of course, well, you've got the full row of jelly beans with me because we're only 11 kilometres apart, according to QRZ.com. And just still on the subject of disruptions and all that, my Apple iPhone decided to go out in sympathy with all this stuff. It's developed some crazy processor fault now where it won't switch off, and the standard remedy scan via the Apple helpline says hit the volume up button, volume down button, and then the power off button, and it should switch off. No, when I do that, it starts bringing up its own numbers to try and unlock my keypad, and of course you only get 10 goes at that before it destroys your data, so I'm a bit concerned. I got an appointment on Sunday at 1300 hours or something down at Fountain Gate, and thought, oh no, that's too long to wait, so early this morning got in the car and drove 40 minutes to get down there, only to be told no exceptions, you're going to have to wait until Sunday, and I couldn't even leave the phone there, so that was a bit annoying. We don't have landline into our place, so I'm quite restricted now. I don't have the phone to look up call signs and do all the usual things that I do. And there was a Shire contest on 40 and 80, or is going on at the moment, probably for both days. Again, I can't look up the internet to find out when it's all on, but I made a whole lot of contacts around VK4, 3, 2, 5 and 7, and had no means of working out too much about them all. But as I said, my phone's gone out in sympathy, and there's no end to the frustrations with electronic devices. Don't we all know it? Anyway, enough waffle for this over from me. Oh, by the way, don't think anything you said qualifies as waffling or rambling on there, Chris. It's all good copy, and thank you for it. Anyway, back to you, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ.
No more breakers. VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML. Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry to hear about the amount of damage up that way, and probably from where you are you can look up the hill and see some of the trees that have come down. I know that a friend of mine in Bayswater, back towards Stud Road, is it Stud Road there? I think. She can look up the hill, and she tells me that a lot of trees that were there earlier in the week have disappeared off the horizon. She gets used to the contour of the hill. That hill that sticks out there, One Tree Hill, and I think they call it Dunn's Hill. There's a little hill in front of that to the west of it. Had the hang on, my level's a bit high. Had the week not included a COVID lockdown and the bad weather, I would have been up there on the hill, on One Tree Hill, with my portable VHF setup and the little tablet computer, and would have been experimentally transmitting pictures from up there via digital slow scan. I've got the whole system now portable, and I'm enthusiastic to try it out in the field. I actually had it on Deal Island while we were down there, but there was nobody on the mainland who was actually set up to receive it, even if we'd transmitted it. So what with one thing and another, we were a bit tired too. You can imagine sleeping in tents after throwing up for 3.5 hours on the boat on the way to the island, and then getting no sleep or very little sleep for 3 nights. We were pretty well stuffed. So we did as much as we comfortably could while we were there. So thank you for that, Peter. And looking forward to seeing you now at the July meeting of the Sherbrooke Radio Club, which is now moved to a church in Baronia. Before we move on to David, could you just give the details of the address of the meetings for the Sherbrooke Radio Club now now that you've moved from the Scout Hall in Ferntree Gully. VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Jim would want it broadcast far and wide, but I can say that anybody interested, the website is VK3KID, Kilo India Delta, or the Sherbrooke Community Radio Club. If you Google that, you'll find the website. The details will be there. But it's going to be, the first Monday night in July, if we don't have one sooner, and it doesn't sound like we're going to have one sooner at this stage. I was speaking to Jim this morning on 80, and I think he's most interested in getting away bush as soon as the acting chairman, opens the gates again and lets us all out, if he hasn't thrown away the key. But the first Monday night in July, and it'll be the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Baronia. There are the details there. Chris, back to you.
Yeah, just while we had the stream up and working well, I thought it was worthwhile getting a recording of that on the stream so that people who are regulars here could know where it is. I've, over the last 3 or 4 months, become a regular attendee of the Sherbrooke group. Nice group of blokes, smallish radio club, but their meetings attract between 15 and 25 people, which really surprised me. So looking forward to more contact up there, and it's very easy for me to get from here to there by public transport, which is a major plus. Yeah, good. We've covered that. So over now to David, if you're still there. I hope you are, but it's been a bit long to come round to the group. VK3ECG, and sorry I didn't connect with the David that I met at the club. I hope you understand. Quite often when you talk to people on the air here, and then you meet them face to face, one or the other doesn't connect, or maybe it's just, maybe I've blown a fuse in the head somewhere. Fifth syndrome, as my wife called it. She was a psychiatric nurse. We didn't meet professionally, I hasten to add. VK3ECG, VK3, I always have to throw that in, VK3ECG, VK3AML, and group.
VK.
Acknowledging EGG.
Yes, VK3ECG turning. Yes, fine there, Chris. Yes, I understand the issues. Psychiatric nurses certainly have a very good insight into a whole series of human behaviours, as I'm sure you're well aware. But there we are. Yes, and yes, the stream was very good tonight, and everything seemed to go very, very smoothly. It is fascinating, the sort of legislative changes, and I suppose these days you would describe, we have this new word of edutainment, which has penetrated a whole heap of from both the sort of educational side, but also the entertainment side. So edutainment, as is now referred, seems to have quite a strong following. And I suppose you could sort of say that a lot of the archival material, if you like, is that both educational and entertaining because of its educational value. So, but as you say, meaning of legislation depends on how it's tested at the end of the day in a court, and there are a lot of people who would be, I'm sure, presenting that sort of the historical framework, as you say. I mean, when I was licensed, I was still licensed in the UK. In those days when I was first licensed, I think it was actually 1972, when I was still at school, and the rules were, fairly strict. Although there were, of course, a whole series of people who were broadcasting music and other entertainment type activities as well. But yeah, it's interesting actually using music in that particular way. I did some teaching out at the Trobe one stage, and one of the people whose course I taught on used to have every lecture introduced by a piece of music that the lecturer chose, which the audience had to listen to it didn't have to be related to what was being talked about. I think I put up Mozart Requiem or something like that, which probably was, at least in part, related to what I'll be talking about, but there we are. Yes, I was actually able to copy Chris very, very faithfully. He was right in the noise for Riddles Creek, and but again, with the delay, I was able to go back quickly and listen to it on the feed on the web as well, so that worked quite well. Yes, we've been very lucky here in North Warrandyte. Normally we get power losses quite regularly, so it wouldn't be unusual for us to have at least one sort of short power outage, probably once a month or more. I think, possums get on the line, get electrocuted, and then the line cuts out, and then they turn it on again within about sort of 30 seconds or so to see if they've come off the line, and if they've stayed on the line or whatever, then they'll try it again, and then it'll be out for half an hour. They send a crew around to see what's happened at that point on the line. So we get that sort of thing all the time, but on this particular occasion with this storm, we had nothing at all, no electrical problems whatsoever. And that's quite extraordinary. Everyone around us seems to be in trouble, but we've been spared. In North Warrandyte, I think there's been loss in Warrandyte itself, but in some areas, but not us. We had a few big branches down, of course, and across the driveway, but living up here, chainsaws are part of the ordinary gardening equipment, and so there's no real difficulty from that point of view, but fortunately we don't have any trees very close to the house anymore now, and that's a relief in many ways. But the house has actually got an interesting wood frame construction, and it creaks when the wind gusts hit it, which is somewhat alarming sometimes at night. But there we are. Anyway, Chris, I'll put it back to you and the group. So VK3AML and the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3CG and group VK3AML. Thanks for that, David. And glad that you've escaped any problems up there in Warrandyte, where there's certainly a lot of trees around there. My wife and I go up there and to Christmas Hills, Kangaroo Ground Milk Bar and all that sort of thing quite frequently if we wanted to cut out of the city for a while. As for the regulations, I have here on my desk in front of me, and I'll hold this up for the webcam, handbook for operators of amateur wireless stations, and this is the first post-war handbook of the Wireless Telegraphy Act regulations. And these were in operation until the 90s, most of these regulations, and I'll just read out a couple of them. The use of amateur stations for the transmission or receipt of messages for third parties, either within or beyond the Commonwealth, or of any message in consideration of payment in cash or kind, or of any item of an advertising nature, direct or indirect, is expressly forbidden. Discussions or conferences relating to matters connected with the trades or occupations of the amateur licensees concerned, which would be conducted normally by means of public services available, this is getting back to the PMG monopoly of the time, will not be permitted. For example, a licensee who is engaged in any trade or profession and uses his station for the purpose of furthering his knowledge of such trade or profession with a pecuniary interest, or for obtaining information regarding costs, methods of production, advances in design, etc., which is not available to other persons, is guilty of an infringement of the regulations under the Wireless Telegraphy Act. Well, that has kind of slipped. Quite frequently you hear people talking about sources of amateur radio equipment, and under that very draconian application it might be considered an infringement, but really, who would be worried these days? And then the important one, paragraph 34, the usage of amateur stations for the transmission of music or any form of entertainment is prohibited. However, single audio frequency tones may be transmitted for tests of short duration. Well, that has changed. The Act specifies that entertainment is not allowed. And that term is vague, I suspect purposely vague, so that it can be taken to mean what anybody who gets their nose out of joint takes it to mean, and therefore is enforceable. So I think the rule is, if you'll pardon me using the expression, don't piss people off. If I may be so rude, that's the basic. So, don't spread too far, don't cause spurious emissions, and don't transmit material that would be likely to offend Mother Grundies at a time when they're likely to complain. In other words, transmitting, for example, on 80 or 160 metres during a competition, a contest, or transmitting music, even of short duration or incidental to the transmission, at a time when elderly people who think the Wireless Telegraphy Act still applies might be there to listen and take offence. So it all has to be done with the application of, I think, a large amount of good sense and consideration. Anyway, with that I'll hand it round to VK3EGG. What do you have? What's been on your plate this week, John? Have you had any trees come down where you are? VK3EGG and the group VK3AML.
Yes, 3AML, VK3GG. Yes, well, I think there are people out there that forget that amateur radio is a hobby, and they engage in a hobby of being amateur policemen rather than interested in the various aspects of radio. No, there haven't been any trees come down here, but the other end of the hill seems to have no power, so RAJ repeater's gone flat, but the Emerald one that's on the link is still working. Of course, given what you just said, this whole transmission we're having tonight is illegal, because someone might find it entertaining, and therefore to them it's entertainment. So yes, that's probably how broadly you could interpret things. Well, as for people who live in the hills rather than the suburbs, well, where I'm living now is as close to the suburbs as I could afford to buy anywhere at the time. Anywhere closer in the suburbs was more than twice the price, which I couldn't spend. So quite a lot of people who live on the very outer suburbs and up into the Dandenongs and past Warrandyte or all that sort of thing have often done so because they can't buy anywhere any closer. In fact, another friend of ours, an amateur who comes to pub dinner, was looking at buying a place. He had to go out past Pakenham and places like that to even think about buying a place now. So yes, that's where we are at the moment. So how far out you've got to go into the sticks is even worse now than it was 12 years ago. Yeah, I listened to the thing all night. I found all the things about World War II and that quite interesting. So yes, it's all in all been very entertaining. VK3GG bike.
Oh, don't say that, John. You'll get me in wrong. Look, that business of entertainment, let's face it, if amateur radio wasn't entertaining, would any of us be involved with it in the first place? I mean, the application of that word obviously is fairly broad. I think, generally we know what they mean, but you could use it if you're in a position of power to mean anything that you wanted it to mean. And, the situation is if you're playing something, heavy metal music on a call channel continuously, as people do on CB radio frequently, with the intention of annoying, that would be certainly beyond the letter of the law and could be enforced in a court of law, particularly if you wanted to get rid of a person who was intentionally being a nuisance. Just in connection with that, thinking back to the mid to late 60s when a friend of mine, Roland, I had a pair of walkie-talkies on 27.24 megs, single channel, 100 milliwatts. This is in 1967. As a test, Roland would play continuously one of those records you used to get by tearing them out of the back of Mad magazine, MAD. And it was Alfred E. Newman's record of the Mad Belch record, It's a Gas, with Hammond organ accompaniment. Somewhere I have an MP3 of it, but I guarantee I won't play it tonight. I better hand it round to Peter before I really get myself in wrong. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
VK3AML in group VK3ACZ. You're talking about that. You reminded me of that wonderful old Goodies episode where they set up the pirate radio station and proceeded to play Walk in Black Forest over and over continuously for hours and hours. Oh dear. Yeah, well, the entertainment is a very broad thing, isn't it? I don't always manage to get there. It must be the right kind of ducting or whatever, but I was on the 6-metre repeater on Mount William this evening, and I found that very entertaining, so I would have been breaking the law as well. Hi. Yeah, and your broadcast would definitely be taken off the air because it's super good value. And my last word about the storm, and I mean, who can forget it? It's the elephant in the room at the moment, let's face it. We've either lost power or know somebody who has, and I lived in the Dandenongs, or up at Mount Dandenong, between 1992 and 2000, and we had the last of the 6.5k line up there, and I think that's because the mountain ash trees drop their bark, which falls across the line, and they didn't want major catastrophes. I believe it's the last place in the state that had 6.5 kV line, but anyway, that's another story. Power would go off at least once a month up there. So frustrating. You've set the video recorder to watch a program when you were going to be out, or even looking forward to watching something while you were there. No guarantee of it at all. And boy, do we take our power for granted. Lost power here, a few months ago with the storm, and we were without for 3 days, and I was practically climbing the walls. I mean, I've improved things. I can still play radio now. I've got a pair of 100 amp hour batteries, a lithium and a glass mat. But yeah, you don't know how lucky you are. I was overwhelmed on Thursday's evening TV news when I saw the carnage up there, some of the film footage. I remember a storm, it was just a windstorm would have been 1998, and I thought that was bad with trees down, but that had nothing on this one, and it was, that one was pretty much confined, the damage was confined to the Dandenongs. But this is way further than that. You know, the Lilydale and a few other suburbs. Well, Monbulk is still without power, as Graham mentioned before. Just grateful I wasn't part of it. Wednesday night, while it was all happening, I was on a 70 centimetre net, the Knights of the Round Table with Sean 3KK. And the only worry I had was that I shone a torch out off the back patio and it looked like a bit of a river. There was about 3 or 4 inches of water running across the backyard. I wasn't worried about wind, I was worried about water, and well, that's obviously a problem if you live down at Traralgon, or you must have seen the shots of the, is it the Melba Highway? Which one is it, going up to Yarra Glen? Yeah, that was a bit of a swimming pool. That took me by surprise. But that's enough talk about the storm for tonight. I might make this my final, Chris, and say 7-3 to you and all your listeners and everybody else listening on the side, Professor David and whoever else is still there. And look forward to tuning in again next week, as I will. Thank you so much for the broadcast, Chris, and best 7-3. VK3AML from VK3ACZ will be going clear shortly.
Okay, I gave a bit of a gap there in case anyone wanted to call in. Thanks for that, Pete. Yeah, I was looking at the SES site yesterday, and a lot of people up 3ZIG's area, north of Healesville, were lacking power and also lacking internet. So I actually, on the wasn't the Mount St Leonard one, it was the Briarty Hill Healesville repeater. They asked me to read out the SES warnings for the area, and I did note that the northern part of Coldstream, the airport, and the gun club up the top end of the road there, the road that runs north of Lilydale through Coldstream, was one big lake, and people were advised not to drive through that area for obvious reasons. So it's under these circumstances, over the last few days I've actually heard amateur radio coming into its own, not quite as an emergency medium, but certainly where everything else has fallen apart. It certainly underlined the fact that mobile phones are nowhere near as reliable as they might be, particularly in cases of fire or flood or other forms of damage to the power supplies thereof or the actual phone towers. Obviously they're vulnerable, and this is where ham radio really comes into its own as a backup. David, VK3CG, are you still with us? VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ECG, turning yes, and fine Peter and all of that. It is fascinating what works and what doesn't work. I can sort of go off grid for power for a short while at least, and having UPS for computers and things like that. But anything that's really for a longer period of time, apart from some portable lithium batteries and bits and pieces like that with a couple of inverters and so on, that I can run isolated items in the house, nothing with any great power. But fortunately, with wood burning stoves and things like that, we can stay pretty comfortable, which is nice. And of course, because I've been sort of working through the lockdown in any event, I've been a little bit more mobile than perhaps other people have been. I must say, it is certainly a nice part of the world to be in up here, and it's really strange how incredibly busy the place becomes as soon as the travel issues are resolved and people can come out of the city and come out, and certainly this part of the world is a place people come out to. The cafes are full, you can't park, and indeed, while the lockdown was extreme, it was actually quite pleasant around London, I'd have to say, which sounds a bit selfish, but it certainly did change the nature of the place in a funny way, both good and bad. But something that's always worth thinking about. But yes, no, I mean, the dangers of being in this area, of course, are clear and understood. And I do remember the responses to the bushfires, and actually driving around from place to place, and with the chainsaw on the back of the car and following SES and things like that. And it's a very salutary experience getting involved in those sorts of things. But that's inevitably part of what we have to do. But there we are. I probably won't hold it much longer, so like Pete, I shall try and get off, I think. But I'm not sure whether Graham was still there, but anyway, Chris, I'll put it back to you. VK3AML on the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf, going QRT soon. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, David, and thanks for coming up. Really appreciate it. VK3CAE, Chris, are you still with us?
Yeah, sorry, I ducked off under 80 metres to hand a few numbers out to some ZL3 stations.
Oh, is there a competition? Is there a contest going on 80 metres?
The CQ's Shires contest is on.
Ah, okay. No worries. I hadn't called you in because I kind of got the impression that you were not coming back. But anyway, very welcome. And you'll be able to hear yourself on the stream. The copy tonight is significantly better than I've ever heard you before, so I don't know. Have you done something to your antenna or your transmitter?
I've changed the coax on my HF and my VHF UHF setup, and I'm also going to change the antenna, but I'm in midstream on making a few changes here. I'm also going to put up a large loop around the block as well.
Well, you're strength 5 to 6 on 2 metres, and over this distance, that's not bloody bad. You were down about strength 2 or 3 when we last spoke, so congratulations on making those changes. What would the distance be, about 60 clicks?
Oh, easily, Chris. It would be that, yes, no worries.
Yeah, I thought so. Had some friends that lived at Riddles Creek, and so I that's just before Lansfield, isn't it?
No, Romsey's just before Lansfield. Riddles Creek's probably closer to Gisborne, and we're about 17 kilometres north of Sunbury, 17, 18 k's north of Sunbury.
Yeah, you'd be going over a range of hills there. I don't think we'd be direct, but it's amazing where 2 metres gets to, eh?
And anyway, I have made a few changes, and I'm still about to make some more. So things happen slowly around here. I've got too many projects on the go, Chris. VK3CAE to VK3AML.
Oh, don't I know that? Putting these programs together for a Saturday night knocks out at least half a day, sometimes a whole day. Now that I'm retired, I can attack things like this, and it is rewarding, particularly now that I can stream it. And I know we have a few viewers in places like USA who may not listen to us on the direct stream, but because it's wee small hours in the west coast of America right now, it would be coming up on, I think, 7 a.m. on the west coast. But they quite frequently listen to the replay, which is good. Most weeks I can keep the replay up. Every now and then I strike a copyright problem that YouTube will give me a ding on. Most times it's just I cannot monetize the stream, which I'm not concerned about anyway, but more often than not I've used inadvertently some copyright that involves the silencing of the soundtrack, so I have to delete the whole stream. I just hope I don't have to do it this week. There were a couple of little bits of music in there, and there are bots, copyright bots that search the net and tend to misidentify very short pieces of music, and even on wax cylinders from 1896 I've had copyright hits. You just can't predict where they'll come. So that's Chris. Are you still with us, Graham, DLW, or have you gone? VK3AML.
No, I've been reading the mail, to be honest, Chris. So I'm still around. VK3AML, VK3DLW. But yeah, because it's been an interesting discussion. But look, I won't hold it. But it's interesting because the regulations, as you say, are not. Just harking back to that topic, the regulations are not what they used to be. When I did get my license, I don't know if it was the Official Secrets Act. We certainly had to sign a declaration of secrecy for radio communications, which I think fell under the Radio Telegraphy Act. But anyhow, it's well, judging from what I hear on the air today, things have definitely changed. VK3AML, the group VK3DLW.
Well, that's for sure. One of these days, once I've bleeped the necessary recording, I must play a recording of some of the things I've heard on 80 metres from American groups, which range from Ku Klux Klan. They actually have a net. Oh, God. And you can access it via web-based SDRs. Ranging from that through nets where pro-Trump supporters discuss the potential murdering of Biden supporters or vice versa. 80 metres in America is, in some cases, worse than the worst I've heard from CB. On CB you can't take it seriously because nobody is identified. On ham radio, as people identify themselves with their call signs, one cannot help but take it seriously, and some of it's a real worry. That's actually the 75 metre band that the worst of that occurs on. That's the band above our normal 80 metre band from 3.8 to 4 megs, which is part of the 80 metre band nominally in America, but referred to as 75 metres, perhaps more accurately. VK3G, anything to add? I might bring it the net to a close for the night myself. I'm feeling a bit hoarse. I haven't had enough caffeine, and my caffeine to blood ratio is going the wrong way. There has to be more caffeine than blood. VK3G, VK3AML and group.
Yes, 3AML, VK3GG. Well, seeing that America has far stricter rules on putting on music and entertainment on amateur radio than we do, yet on the same thing they allow you to have the Ku Klux Klan and terrorist organisations like that preaching their horrors on radio. Well, I think that sounds like complete hypocrisy. I think they should forget about any rules stopping you putting on music and entertainment, because that's certainly not conspiring to commit terrorism. Yes, and as for the power, well, I remember, when was it? Around about last July, August, I was without power in Otway for about a week when we had those really high winds, because it affected this end of the hill. But like I said, the latest storms seem to have affected the other end of the hill that's half a kilometre away where the RAJ repeater is. Actually, the Nicholas Vineman of Selfish Cone Chip was flapping his leaves about the mobile phones and the DNBN power, the node boxes at the end of the street, and how the ones that have batteries in only have enough reserve to work for about 2 hours if you're lucky. So that's why they've been having to move generators in, as I saw on the news, to power half these things up throughout the Dandenongs, because there's only about 2 hours of battery power to run a mobile phone tower. I know they have all these batteries in there, but they only last about that long. And I'm not even sure that all of the NBN node boxes you see at the end of streets now have batteries in them anyway. Some, I believe, do. But it means that a lot of them don't go for very long or don't go at all if the power fails. Anyway, that's just my comments at the moment, so I'll just put it by for whoever it is to take it there. VK3GG, bye.
Okay, well, let's see. I think it should go around to you, Peter, if you're still there. With a pause, if anybody else would like to break in at this late hour. VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with a pause. You there, Peter? No, sounds like he's gone. Would anybody else like to make a comment before I tie the ribbons? VK3AML, standing by.
Just wondering if I need to expand on my 30 seconds over New York comment, Chris, or do you get where I was going with that?
Not sure. Go ahead.
Well, the B-25 was used in the Doolittle raid over the first air raid on Japan, and the movie about that was called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo.
Oh, okay, I got you. Okay. You mean not the raid where they dropped it on Hiroshima?
No, it was the first air raid they conducted on Japan from a carrier. The Japanese thought that they that the Americans couldn't bomb them, so they managed to get B-25s to launch off a carrier. As a medium bomb, a bit unusual. They couldn't land on a carrier, but they could take off. They flew towards the Japan home islands. They had to launch before they'd planned to, because they'd got spotted by a Japanese picket boat, and so they were further away than their mission planning. And the plan was for them to land in China, but quite a few didn't make it, although Doolittle and quite a few of his crew did make it back, and of course Doolittle came to command one of the air forces subsequently from the UK. So it's an interesting history, but that was the reference, and I thought perhaps it deserves some explanation. VK3AML, VK3DLW.
Yeah, which you've done quite well, Graham. Thank you for that. I wasn't tremendously sure. My research has been very much more on World War I than World War II, I must admit. Purely from a personal point of view, I have dealt more with sound recordings from the First War than the Second. And the number of recordings available from the Second World War are far wider and more numerous than they are in the First. The First War, you couldn't quite count all the spoken word recordings on the fingers and toes, but there was less than 1,000, I think you'd probably be right, resources in the First World War. There were some unexpected ones. The Germans... there was a German linguistic institute that wanted to study the accent and regional variations of the English language. So they discovered during the First World War that they had a vast untapped resource in their prisoner of war camps. So one of the German scientists set up a disc recording machine at a POW camp and recorded literally hundreds of Allied prisoners, all given sections of material to read or to say, to make a record of their regional accents in about 1915-16, and all of these recordings survive in the same German educational institution in Hanover, I think. And just recently they've been digitised, and they make interesting listening. One of these nights I'll have to make a selection of the more interesting ones and put them up. Second World War, though, being a radio war, there were lots of on-the-spot commentaries done which really bring home the essence of the conflict, like that D-Day stuff that I played, so it's a bit easier to find interesting and engaging material from that war. Anyway, with that, does anybody want to make any final comment before we close? VK3AML standing by.
Well, I guess we might say evening. Well, I don't think they would have killed all the prisoners in World War I like they did in World War II after they recorded them either.
Interesting that. The First War, I've always taken the attitude that although the causes and the reasons for the First War were not as clear-cut as the Second, and I probably would have been a conscientious objector in the First World War. I certainly wouldn't have been a conscientious objector in the Second. It really was a clear-cut case of the free world battling for existence. And there appears to have been a greater sense of chivalry and, how can you put it, working to the rules more applied during the First World War, particularly with regard to the well-being of prisoners of war. The Second War, they suffered a great deal more, I think. John, back to you.
Yes, particularly in Germany. But anyway, yes, that's probably true too. And the other thing is in World War One, they, if you look at the, well, actually in the repatriation hospital in Heidelberg, they had this show on. It was a museum thing of what it was like leading up to World War One. And they had all these things where they presented, like people were signing up to go and compete in the Olympics or something. So a lot of people were sucked in to sign up because of that, and then they found that they just got mowed down in Gallipoli and places like that.
Yeah, I think I might have actually seen that Prue had to go out to the Repat Hospital for something for her father. I forget what it was. Her father died 8 years ago at the age of 98. So he managed to live to a great age. He was in the forces during the Second World War, chiefly at Catherine, manning an anti-aircraft gun. The Japanese bombings came that far inland that they bombed Catherine at one stage, a long way in from Darwin. And my father actually went up to Darwin sometime after the first bombing, and although the devastation was quite severe, Darwin in 1942 was a much, much smaller place than it is now. So there wasn't much to bomb. I remember one of the last times I had a conversation with my dad before he finally lapsed into unconsciousness with the cancer that he had in January 1975. He was holding up the paper with the pictures of the devastation of Darwin with Cyclone Tracy. And he said, "Have a look at this, son." And he was showing me the front page of the Sun, and he said, the devastation they've got there now is a hell of a lot worse than we saw during the Darwin bombing. Now, your father, John, interesting point, your father worked in, as I understand it, in espionage, because he was one of the few Australians that had a good working knowledge of Japanese during the war. Do you know very much about your father's work that way? Sorry to start a new conversation at this stage, but I am curious. VK3AML, VK3AML.
Yes, 3AML, VK3GG. Yes, he's in intelligence. In fact, he even went to places like Bletchley Park, but I think he started off with the thing they had in Albert Park and St Kilda and all that. Actually, he ended up knowing 28 languages because of what he did. He could speak quite a few of them, but not all of them. He could read about 28 of them, because when the various people like Alan Turing's thing decoded it all, then there were people a line below that then had to turn it into language people could read or something. And I think that's where my father fit in. He was also in the occupation of Japan just after the bomb was dropped and all those sorts of things. So that's what I know. Of course, he wasn't allowed to say much about anything that he did. And of course, he was in ASIO after that as well, and he wasn't allowed to mention any of that. So, yes.
Gosh, he may be the reason that I have an ASIO file, which I think I mentioned last week.
Well, I would have one as well, because all family members of people who were in any way associated with ASIO automatically had an ASIO file.
Oh, well, there we are. Our private lives exposed for perpetuity when they finally declassify it 40 years after we're dead or something.
Well, yeah, but a lot of those people also got the red carpet ride to being professors in universities because of what they did in the war, and my father was one of those. And there was Les Oates, his colleague, and I think there was Harry Simons, who ran the whole Oriental Studies Department in Melbourne Uni. All of those people worked in intelligence during the war, and there were some other radio people. In fact, my first ARRL, that was a 1942 book general with how to destroy the book and stop the enemy getting it for the first few pages when you opened it up, was given to me by one of those people when I was a kid. So, yes.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned that. Years ago, off Flinders Lane near Swanson Street, you'd go up to the first floor of a building. I've forgotten the name of the building. And there were a number of small shops there, including a bookshop called Book Affair. And my understanding was that the owner of the shop used to purchase books by the pound and flog them off fairly cheaply. And I'd go up there, and he had some very interesting technical texts, including the papers and proceedings of IEE on conferences, things to do with encryption and the finer details of frequency hopping on HF, and even the Jindalee project, which was over the horizon radar. And I bought a few of them, and I was told by the guy when I asked how they'd come to be on the shelf there. I still have them somewhere, but they're very old now, about 30 years old. He told me that there had been a shipment due to go from Melbourne with all of these publications to the Middle East, to Iraq, and this is in the days of Saddam Hussein, and the ship had been detained and the books confiscated, and somehow they found their way to book a fare. So, Mr. Hussein could have put an agent in a second-hand bookshop in Melbourne and got them. But it amused me that I managed to find them, and when I saw the details of the Jindalee project, I thought, what? VK3EGG, VK3AML.
Yeah, 3AML, VK3GG, yes, all the most interesting. Yeah, in fact, there used to be a whole lot of good little bookshops like that in the middle of the city that you could go to. I used to frequent some of those shops too and find all sorts of electronic books and things. But I think they're all gone now.
I think there might be one called Basement Books still operating. And just before we hand it back, does anybody else want to chip in here with a comment? VK3GG, with a pause for any breakers, VK3AML.
I'll just say good night, everyone, from VK3 Echo Charles Golf. I just really enjoyed this evening. Great chat and really interesting stuff. So chat again sometime soon. Just going QRT now. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
All the best, David. Thanks for coming in. And playing this stuff had exactly the desired effect. I wanted it to stimulate the good old rag chew of days of old, which it seems to do. That's... it repays me for the effort. VK3GG to take, VK3AML.
Yeah, 3AML, VK3GG. Yes, I probably won't hold that much longer either because I haven't had dinner yet. But so I'll go and cook that in a moment. But I wonder where Dave Stewart is these days. I haven't heard much of him, but anyway, I just thought of that before. There was some story he was planning to move up the bush or something. I don't know whether that's happened or not there. But yes, it's certainly been an interesting night. I'll just put it back for any comments and we'll see where we take it from there.
I was half expecting Dave to come up then. You never know where he'll pop up. My understanding is that the kids are almost off his hands now, and where he is neither very good in internet connection, nor is it very good from a radio point of view, being reasonably in a city, McKinnon or Ormond or wherever he is there. So he was looking in, he was perusing the idea of moving, and I believe also looking into the possibility, only the possibility, of an NVIS transmitting license, broadcast license for about 2.3 megs, because all of the stations that used to be there, run by the ABC in Tennant Creek and Alice Springs, seem to have disappeared, and HF licenses may be had for virtually nothing. I mean, nobody listens there anymore because most of the international broadcasters have closed, so what's there to listen to? Just a boring old fart like me and a boring old fart like you, John. VK3GG, VK3AML.
Yeah, 3AML, VK3GG. Yes, well, although actually a lot of other countries still do have international shortwave broadcasting services, so Australia is probably one of the few Western developed countries that doesn't have one anymore.
Oh, I don't know. Voice of America's been cut right back. I think it might have gone. Radio Canada has gone. Radio Nederland, Hilversum in Holland, I think, is gone. Most of those shortwave broadcasters that were prominent in the 60s have gone. HCJB, I think, has closed their Quito, Ecuador transmitter forever. And I think they have a Christian transmitter somewhere up Wyndham or Broome, or certainly Anthony was looking at getting involved with that for a while, he having a background in Salvation Army. VK3EGG, VK3AML.
3AML, VK3EGG. I think it was the chief engineer of HCJB who invented the quad antenna, in fact.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Interesting.
Well, he was trying to solve the problem that if you ran high power into multi-element Yagis with their sharp, pointy elements, you got corona discharge at the end of the elements. The elements actually melted and got shorter and shorter and shorter because the power they were running, the corona discharge was melting the elements.
Bloody hell.
So his idea was to have two Yagis, one above the other, and bend the elements on the top one down and the bottom one up to form loops, and that would solve the problem. And of course the quad antenna was born, and it got rid of the corona discharge problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far back a quad goes. Certainly goes back to just after the Second World War, but I'll have to look it up.
It's either just after, it might have been just before the war when this guy invented, I'm not sure, but they became popular after the war, yes.
Yeah, I believe that they had some trouble with the government of Ecuador that caused them to leave the country, but for a long time they were the single most notable shortwave signal out of South America.
Yeah, I think they were.
Anyway, have we got any other breakers at the moment before we close? VK3AML, standing by.
VK3, VJS has been listening with interest, Chris.
Yeah. Good night, Chris and John. Thanks for a good evening. The only other thing, my father worked for the PMG department, and just talking about the Darwin raids, the postmaster there actually got killed during one of the raids. It was, by all accounts, pretty unlucky. They were sheltering in a slit trench, and a bomb actually landed in the trench and killed him, and I imagine all others who were sheltering in it. So, just on World War One or World War Two, reading the most concerning thing to me about, reading John Keegan's history of World War One. He said, for all of those folks who think that international trade and the interrelationships between countries would stop it happening again, you need to understand just the extent to which those relationships existed prior to World War One. And he went through a huge amount of detail about the international relationships of trade and culture and everything that existed back then. But it still happened nevertheless, anyway. So it was possibly the most, I don't know what you'd call, concerning thing to me, that no matter what might exist today, it can still happen, unfortunately. Anyway, I'm going to go to bed, and thanks for everything, Chris, and interesting to hear what your comments there, John, about the background of you and your family. All fascinating, and I'll catch up with you possibly next week. VK3 EML, VK3 EGG, VK3 DLW, clear, and saying good night. 7 threes.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Very nice to have you there, and probably we'll see you at the next Sherbrooke meeting with any luck. Wait a minute, you're in Warrandyte?
Selby.
Oh, sorry, I got the two of you confused, David and you. Yeah, Selby. It's a very nice VHF location, you're nice and high.
Yes, well, I'm not hearing. I'm not sure who it was Chris in Riddles Creek. Anyway, whoever was in Riddles Creek, I couldn't hear them at all, unfortunately. Go ahead.
One Tree Hill, from my calculation, would be right in the way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, One Tree Hill. incidentally, of all the places in the Dandenong Ranges I've looked at for VHF communication, that seems to be the most attractive, because it's the maximum distance away from Mount Dandenong, where most of the muck is, and Burke's Lookout, but still retaining the height.
Yeah, we actually looked at a place there, but that didn't quite suit our needs.
The fellow at Riddles Creek was fully quieting in Upway.
Yeah, well, you're sort of clear of One Tree Hill and with a view up that way. You're in an excellent VHF location. But Selby's kind of further back. There is from here we look up a sort of a gun sight between your hill and One Tree Hill up towards Belgrave, John.
Yeah, that's right, because you go around behind One Tree Hill and that, so I can see what the situation would be. Yes, just trying to coordinate a cat that's being curious around the shack too.
You're coordinating a cat?
I'm trying to stop the cat walking on things that he shouldn't, or the missions might go off the air, and so I'm holding the cat and trying to carry on the missions.
Can't you put some pepper on your missions to keep the cat away?
Don't think it works with him.
Well, you could always use the method that Tony Sanderson used with his dog Taffy, when it lifted its leg on the transmitter top cap and got 3 kV.
Oh, did he have a dog called Taffy? Because he had a dog called Kip or something when I knew him.
Yeah, Kip was the black dog later in the 70s. In the early 70s, when I first met him, 69, 70, he had a little corgi named Taffy. And corgi had a nasty habit of sniffing anything that was warm and lifting its leg on it. And he finally did it to an 813.
Yes, that wouldn't have been very comfortable for the dog, would it?
Well, he never had puppies.
Well, I don't think dogs that lift legs have puppies anyway.
I mean, he didn't father any.
Oh, I don't know whether he got a chance to, did he?
Probably not. I'm not sure. But certainly he was there when I first met Tone. That was when Tony had a stepfather, Mr. Morris. He died very shortly after I met Tony. He would have died about 72.
Yeah, I dare say Tony's mother must have passed on by now too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, heavens. Let me think. Marion. She died about 3 or 4 years after Tony. That was, at a guess, 2012, and then Prue and I helped Anna find a real estate agent for selling Marion's old house, which was also in Newton Street down the road from Tony and Anna, only about 3 doors down on the opposite side of the road. And it's since then been demolished and redeveloped for a flock of blats, VK3EGG, VK3AML.
Yeah, I know, because she sold Park Street and she moved there. In fact, I went there a couple of times with Tony, so I knew where she was. But she was fairly old when Tony died. I think she was about 90-odd.
Yeah, she lived to a great age, and unfortunately all the cigarette smoking took its toll on her cardiovascular health, and she ended up with what do they call it, something to do with blood vessel circulation dementia. There is a name for it. It's a pity that David ECG isn't here. He'd know the medical term, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the other things caused by atherosclerosis when all the fine arteries go for a wreck. Yes, but I forget its name.
Yeah, well, Marion was a fairly heavy smoker, as was Tony, right through. In fact, in Tony's... they had a autopsy for Tony, and the 2 things they found was severe arteriosclerosis due to smoking, and undiagnosed bowel cancer. So the poor guy, had he lived, would have faced a battle.
Yes, so it's a pity he died anyway, because as I said, I last saw him about less than a week before he died. Although I thought he didn't look so good when I saw him that day too.
Yeah, I would have seen him about the same time. We spent an evening together, and he just, how can I put it, he was patting the cat. He had a kitten called Ebony, and it just, I don't know whether you found this, but it seemed he couldn't concentrate.
Yeah, I thought he was a bit like that.
Just he was a bit vague, and then when I got the phone call that he'd had a massive heart attack within about 4 days of that, I thought, oh God. It certainly took me by shock, because I always had kind of... my picture of Tony was perpetually in his 30s. He died at 61.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, because he was exactly 10 years older than me almost.
Yeah, 9 years older than me. Lionel died at 61, same cause, cigarettes and overweight. Jeff Courts, I think, apart from the fact that he had multiple sclerosis, it was fairly aggravated by the smoking.
Yeah, because he'd given up the smoking largely, but not completely, about a year before he died, Jeff Courts. But I think he still had the odd smoke, so he hadn't fully recovered from smoking. But then he had a heart problem that was masked by the multiple sclerosis, so they didn't even diagnose that until very late in the piece, and unfortunately it was too late.
Yes. Do you realise it's 30 years since Darryl died?
Well, it will be on the 18th of December this year.
God, isn't it frightening?
That's right, and the Lester died a month after that, so on the 20th of January next year it'll be 30 years since he died. He was just about to get his amateur licence too. He'd applied and he was due to do the exam, and then he was taken ill and died.
Yeah. Oh well. Anyway, John, I've been on the air 3 hours and 4 minutes according to the register on the stream. This is the first time I've got this stream absolutely working perfectly. No drop frames in 3 hours. I've done it partly by experimenting with different definitions and frame rates, and I found that 720p at 30 frames seems to do the best. And there's an adjustment you can make in this OBS software for latency, and I put it on maximum latency to give it space if there's a buffer underrun, if you can kind of get where I'm coming from, so that it can actually lose stream for occasions and then pick it up by the latency that's in there. That's one of the reasons that people who are watching on the stream are seeing it with 30 seconds delay compared to what they're hearing it on the radio. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to use any internet-based radio system for duplex. The delays are just too great. That's something that certainly I wouldn't have seen coming with internet communication.
Although I believe there's some low latency things you can use for the likes of community radio linking, so you can have multi-channel hi-fi audio, and you can do it with a Raspberry Pi, and you can have something like 50 milliseconds of latency, so you wouldn't notice.
Yeah, interesting. Anyway, I guess we better wrap it up. It's 12:36 a.m, and unlike the early 70s where we'd have 24-hour QSOs, at the age of 67, I find it difficult. I'll hand it back to you for a final, John. And good night to all the other listeners, both on the stream and on the radio. Any final comments, John?
Well, I might say evening, because I don't have a studio, a comfortable chair to sit in, and so I have to hold the cat, whereas if I was sitting in a studio, it would be on my lap, and it's getting a bit impatient with being held and giving me more and more love bites that it wants to move, but every time I put it down it walks in places where it'll put the missions off the air, so I have to pick it up again. So on that note, I think I'll say morning.
Okay, all the best, John. Anyway, I'll wear my headphones so I can just monitor this. For the last 3 hours you've been listening to VK3AML and the group. So we'll bring on the NBC chimes. Oh, isn't it? Thank you. And just as a message for those listening on 147.475 and on the stream, this is a transmission we do just about every Saturday night that we can, short of destroying our social life by monopolising every Saturday night, Sunday morning with it. The idea is to play some spoken word material to stimulate some discussion and get a good old-fashioned Saturday night rag-chewing QSO going, which seems to be such a dying art these days. I've decided to try and kick it into activity. So to the people on the stream, all the best from Melbourne, Australia. If you're listening from abroad, don't forget you can find us on YouTube by dialing VK3AML with the date after it, in this case 12 June 2021, and actually as I speak it's 1 hour or half an hour into 13 June 2021. So crossing my fingers that I don't run into copyright issues with this YouTube clip now. This is VK3AML wishing everybody on the stream a very good